Chapter 2750 Chapter 2750 Testing the Sword with You. Chapter 2750 Testing the Sword with You. Yun Ting smiled foolishly as he fantasized. However, he snapped back to his senses before long and sighed with a vexed expression. However, when can junior sister Baiming ever become a perfected immortal with that martial Tao that she's cultivating? What if I'm already an immortal king by the time junior sister Baiming advances to the perfected one realm? How can we compete at that time? At that thought, Yun Ting looked at Su Zimo resentfully. And you? You cultivated the immortal and Buddhist Taoist yourself but let your eldest disciple cultivate that bullshit martial Tao. Su Zimo said indifferently, go back and prepare well. You won't be able to wait long for this battle. He had been paying attention to Baiming Xue's cultivation the entire time. During this period of time, with his help, Baiming Xue's physique and bloodline were reborn and her Fate Ring realm was infinitely close to perfected. Baiming Xue had a breakthrough in the cultivation of the three great sword arts as well. Right now, all she lacked was an opportunity to advance to the true martial realm. I hope so. Yun Ting sighed softly, still in disbelief. When Su Zimo saw that, he said meaningfully, Brother Yun, there's something I have to remind you of. My intention in arranging for Baiming to spar with you was not to matchmake the two of you or find an opponent for you. Then what was it for? Yun Ting asked. Su Zimo said slowly, when Baiming becomes a perfected immortal, she needs to find someone to test her sword and prove herself in the sword world. You're the most suitable person for that. In reality, even Su Zimo did not know how much Baiming Xue's sword Dao cultivation would increase after she entered the true martial realm. The best way was to find a suitable person for her to test her sword with. Yun Ting was that person. You want to use me to test her sword? The moment Yun Ting heard that, he exploded and sneered, You and your disciple look down on others too much. You've indeed defeated me twice, but you expect your disciple to do the same and even test her sword on me? From a certain perspective, Baiming is not my disciple. Su Zimo said, she's the #1 successor of the martial Tao and you're only her first obstacle in the martial Tao and the sword Tao. All right. Yun Ting sneered, I'd like to see how much of a surprise junior sister Baiming can give me. It won't be a surprise. Su Zimo shook his head gently. When the time comes, just don't disappoint her. Yun Ting. Yun Ting was furious and gritted his teeth. Without saying a word, he turned around and left. If he continued talking to Su Zimo, he was worried that he would not be able to hold it in and would attack Su Zimo. The moment he left the cave abode, he saw Wang Dong and Sword Immortal Tai Lai standing side by side not far away, talking about something. When they saw Yun Ting appear, the two of them welcomed him. Junior brother Yun, did something happen? Wang Dong was very observant and asked when he saw Yun Ting's expression. They'll be fine. Yun Ting waved his hand and changed the topic. Senior brothers, what are you doing here? The two of them exchanged glances. Wang Dong said, Junior brother Yun, since you have a deep relationship with fellow Taoist Su Zhu, we're wondering if you can persuade him to not continue torturing junior sister Baiming. Even the 8 peak masters praised junior sister Baiming's talent in the sword Tao. We're worried that if she continues to cultivate like this, she'll be crippled. Crippled. When Yun Ting heard that, he was infuriated and mocked. How can she be crippled? The martial Tao is so incredibly powerful. When junior sister Baiming becomes a perfected immortal, even I won't be her match. Wang Dong and Sword Immortal Tai Lai were confused by Yun Ting's rebuttal. They did not know where Yun Ting's temper came from. Yun Ting said, I'm not going to persuade him. I want to see how junior sister Baiming can attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation and become a perfected immortal if she can't condense a Tao fruit. Well? Wang Dong and Sword Immortal Tai Lai exchanged glances. Wasn't Yun Ting chummy with his brother-in-law earlier on? Did they have a fight? Pausing for a moment, Yun Ting continued, in addition, senior brothers, it's better for you to restrain the sword cultivators of the various sword peaks. Don't bother having those of the same cultivation realm challenge him lest they embarrass themselves. Even if those of the same cultivation realm gather in a formation, they might not be able to win him, let alone fight one-on-one. Peak of Carnage Sword Peak. This was the center of Carnage Sword Continent and was also where the sword chi was the strongest. Without a grotto heaven cultivation, one could not stand on the peak of the mountain. At that moment, 8 cultivators were gathered at the peak of the mountain. They were either sitting or standing, sipping tea and chatting casually with relaxed expressions. Among the 8 of them there were 7 men and a woman. They were the peak masters of the 8 sword peaks. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak, the only woman among the 8, looked at the figure who was swimming against the current and charging at the Sword Chi waterfall at the foot of Carnage Sword Peak and sighed gently with a pained expression. Baiming Shui has suffered a lot over the past few days. Amit Ba. The peak master of Zen Sword Peak chanted a Buddhist proclamation softly. However, her physique and bloodline are clearly undergoing a metamorphosis. Although she's still unable to condense a Dao fruit, her combat strength is even stronger than before. There shouldn't be any disadvantages for Baiming Shui. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak harumphed coldly. If that wasn't the case, I would have chased her master out of the sword world a long time ago. I wouldn't care even if I was criticized for it. Your temper's still the same as always. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0V3LB1N site. The others smiled. The peak master of Extreme Sword Peak said, speaking of which, her master is from the heavenly world like Yun Ting. To think that he has such a relationship with Yun Ting. The peak master of Illusory Sword Peak frowned. I heard that Yun Ting's sister is one of the 4 great fairies of the heavenly world. I've never heard of her having a Dao companion. I'm not sure about that. The others shook their heads slightly. The heavenly world. The peak master of Fiend Sword Peak pondered for a moment. I heard that a creation green lotus appeared in the heavenly world and condensed into a human body. It has already cultivated to grade 12. I've heard about that too. The peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak had a regretful expression. Unfortunately, that cultivator with the green lotus body was forced into the Emperor's tomb and died. How precious is a grade 12 creation green lotus? Even Emperor Immortal Vanquishing did not manage to nurture it back then. Sigh. The peak master of Tyrant Sword Peak said, it's a pity for that paragon. He can only blame fate for playing tricks on him. If he was born in our sword world, he wouldn't have ended up like this. That's right. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, if he was born in the sword world, the experts of the 8 sword peaks would definitely protect him and allow him to grow smoothly, restoring the glory of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing back then. At the mention of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing, the few of them looked at the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak instinctively. After all, Carnage Sword Peak beneath them was established because of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing. At that moment, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak looked at the withered lotus flowers growing on the peak with a conflicted expression and mixed emotions. On the mountain peak, the sword chi was violent and sharp. Even perfected immortals could not withstand it. However, the withered lotus flowers had been growing here the entire time and it was a strange scene. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak revealed a reminiscent expression and sighed heavily. These lotus flowers were personally planted by Emperor Immortal Vanquishing when he established Carnage Sword Peak back then. Unfortunately, after Emperor Immortal Vanquishing died and the creation green lotus shattered, the lotus flowers withered and never bloomed again. Chapter 2751 Chapter 2751 Breakthrough. Chapter 2751 Breakthrough. Ever since Yun Ting came out of seclusion and acknowledged a brother-in-law, this matter was left unsettled. Although Wang Dong and the others could not bear to see Baiming Shui suffer, they were helpless against Su Zimo, who was almost invincible at the Convergence realm. Everyone could only pray that Baiming Shui would back down and stop at the precipice. Baiming Shui was so talented in the Sword Dao that no one wanted to see her waste her precious time cultivating the martial Dao. In the blink of an eye, 3 years passed. For the past 3 years, Su Zimo had been staying in Baiming Shui's cave abode and had not left. The Convergence perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks knew that they were no match for him and no one came forward to challenge him. As such, he enjoyed peace. As he imparted the Dao to Baiming Shui, he maintained his cultivation. Finally, on this day, Su Zimo felt an opportunity to break through. In reality, the true essence in his body had already accumulated to its peak 2 years ago and he was only waiting for a suitable opportunity. Baiming Shui sensed something at the side and snapped out of her cultivation state. She hurriedly activated the immortal formation in her cave abode. This immortal formation was set up by Su Zimo a year ago to prevent the traces of the Green Lotus bloodline from being leaked when he broke through. Su Zimo raised his head slowly and looked into the skies. There was only the thick stone wall of the cave abode above his head and he could not see anything. However, Su Zimo's eyes seemed to be able to penetrate the layers of void and see the sky outside the cave abode and the firmaments of the sword world. A resplendent starry sky was vaguely reflected in those clear eyes. There was the galaxy hanging upside down, the flow of time and the change of time and space. At that moment, Su Zimo's spirit seemed to have broken through layers of obstacles with the help of the power of the Tao fruit and was connected to the entire universe, resonating with it. In Su Zimo's consciousness, a sparkling fruit spun slowly with a powerful aura. Furthermore, as time passed, the aura continued to rise rapidly. At that moment, it was as though everything had vanished. Even Su Zimo's body vanished. There was only a sparkling and resplendent Tao fruit left in the vast world. The only difference in the dermic formulations of the immortal, Buddhist and fiend Taos were their natures, Tao hearts and intents. However, the dermic Tao profundities were more or less the same. In the lower worlds, immortals, Buddhas and fiends all had golden cores. This was the first time they broke free from the shackles of the world and their lifespans increased to 500 years. After that, there would be heaven and earth dharma characteristics. Among the dermic Taos of immortals, Buddhas and fiends, the most important core was to comprehend the heaven and earth and communicate with it, establishing a connection with it. The heaven and earth dharma characteristic was condensed using the heaven and earth powers. In the lower worlds, cultivators could only comprehend the minor kiliacosms. After ascending to the upper world, cultivators could comprehend an even wider, more perfect and endless medium kiliacosm. The so-called celestial being realm was for cultivators to resonate with the world through their Tao fruits. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0V3LB1N site. The Tao fruit was the crystallization of the essence of the dermic Tao cultivated by cultivators. When that resonance was produced, it was equivalent to the recognition of this Tao fruit. The power of the Tao fruit would increase exponentially. At the same time, the immense power in the Tao fruit would feed back to the cultivator himself once more, allowing perfected immortals who had stepped into the celestial being realm to improve their bodies, bloodlines and essence spirits greatly. The process of stepping into the celestial realm lasted for an entire day. Su Zimo's aura rose continuously as well. As immortal Queen Ling Long had expected, the grade 12 creation green lotus was not the end but only the starting point. The blood chi of the green lotus true body was still increasing and there was no upper limit. His essence spirit cultivation had always been far ahead of his cultivation realm. After entering the heaven immortal realm, the green lotus essence spirit had already reached the paradise void perfected one realm, which was the same as a perfected immortal. The perfected one realm was divided into 4 minor realms. The reason why it was so clear and corresponded to different names was because there was a huge difference in strength between the 4 minor realms. Throughout history, it was extremely rare for paragons and monster incarnates to have essence spirits that were a minor realm above their cultivation realms. As for Su Zimo's green lotus essence spirit, it was 2 minor cultivation realms ahead of him. During the process of Su Zimo breaking through to the celestial being realm, he released a huge amount of true essence energy that filled Baiming Shue's cave abode. Furthermore, during the process of communicating with the world, the resonance was so strong that even the immortal formation set up in the cave abode could not withstand it and cracks appeared. A wisp of the true essence aura of the green lotus true body leaked through the cracks. Right then, Su Zimo opened his eyes and took a deep breath, absorbing the essence chi that filled Baiming's cave abode like a whale swallowing a cow. Baiming Shui guarded Su Zimo the entire time without taking a half step away. For an entire day, she was lucky enough to witness Su Zimo's entire breakthrough. It was way too rare to see and feel it at such a close distance. The mysterious process of comprehending the heaven and earth and communicating with it deeply touched her. Su Zimo's breakthrough this time round was also a huge opportunity for Baiming Shui, allowing her to feel the opportunity to advance to the true martial realm. As for the wisp of true essence that leaked out of Baiming Shue's cave abode, it floated and fused into Carnage Sword Peak. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak was resting with his eyes closed. Suddenly, as though he sensed something, he opened his eyes and his gaze landed on a few withered lotus flowers not far away. The expression of the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak changed and his gaze froze. At that moment, a few of the withered lotus flowers actually had traces of green life. Although there were still no flower buds growing, a few tender green spots appeared on the stems of the green lotuses and new lotus leaves appeared. What happened? Suddenly, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak stood up and stared at the few green lotus flowers in surprise and joy. Right then he sensed something and turned around abruptly. He looked in the direction of Baiming Shue's cave abode and a resplendent sword beam burst forth from his eyes. The aura of the heavenly tribulation. Has Bai Ming-Xue broken through? The heart of the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak skipped a beat with a look of disbelief. In their opinion, Bai Ming-Xue had gone astray when she cultivated the martial Tao. Even if she cultivated that so-called level 9 fate ring and was strong among those of the same cultivation realm, she could never condense a Tao fruit and would never be able to advance to the perfected one realm. But now, the aura of the perfected one heavenly tribulation had already spread from Bai Ming-Xue's side. She did it. After the shock, a look of ecstasy appeared in the eyes of the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak. No matter what, as long as Bai Ming-Xue attracted the perfected one heavenly tribulation, she had a chance of becoming a perfected immortal. Furthermore, what made the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak even more excited was that he felt that he had found the reason for the revival of the lotus flowers. It had to be Bai Ming-Xue. How could there be such a coincidence in the world? Bai Ming-Xue had just broken through and was about to attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation when a few lotus flowers on the mountain peak revived. How impressive was it to have such a phenomenon accompany her when she broke through? According to the trend, after Bai Ming-Xue's tribulation transcendence ended, the green lotuses on the mountain peak would probably awaken and bloom on Carnage Sword Peak once more. In fact, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak suspected that Bai Ming-Xue was the reincarnation of Emperor Immortal vanquishing. Heaven's will, this must be heaven's will. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak muttered excitedly, the heavens are blessing our sword world. Chapter 2752 Chapter 2752 Attention of Everyone. Chapter 2752 Attention of Everyone. 5 Elements Sword Peak. Suddenly, the peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak reached out and plucked a ball of light from the void. The moment his spirit consciousness touched it, he received the information inside. Bai Ming-Xue broke through and attracted the perfected one heavenly tribulation. The peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak had a surprised expression. If not for the fact that the message came from the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak, he would not have believed it. The peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak pondered for a moment and chose to announce the news. Cultivators who wanted to watch Bai Ming-Xue undergo tribulation transcendence could head to Carnage Sword Peak. At the same time, the peak masters of the other 6 sword peaks received news from the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak. The martial Tao that Bai Ming-Xue cultivates can also attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation. From what I know, the 9 fate rings that Bai Ming-Xue cultivated seem to be unable to condense a Tao fruit, right? If she doesn't have a Tao fruit, how can she advance to the perfected one realm? From what I know, the 9 fate rings that Bai Ming-Xue cultivated seem to be unable to condense a Tao fruit, right? If she doesn't have a Tao fruit, how can she advance to the perfected one realm? I'm not sure. However, since it's a message from Brother Lu, it shouldn't be wrong. Let's go take a look too. The other 7 peak masters of Sword Peak were doubtful and did not believe it. However, the 7 of them still chose to announce this matter. As for the other sword cultivators of the Sword Peaks, it was up to them if they wanted to head over and watch. Generally speaking, when sword cultivators of the sword world underwent the perfected one heavenly tribulation, other sword cultivators could watch from the side. However, if the heavenly tribulation was only at the 5th or 6th level, it would not be attractive to most sword cultivators. If he could reach the 7th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation, it would attract many cultivators. For example, when Yun Ting underwent tribulation transcendence back then, the commotion was huge. Almost half of the perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks came and many sword cultivators who were in seclusion came out at the last minute. Have you heard? Bai Ming-Xue of Carnage Sword Peak is about to undergo tribulation transcendence. Really? Her cultivation path is completely different from ours. I wonder which heavenly tribulation she can attract. She's so talented in the sword Tao. The heavenly tribulation probably won't be too weak. Not necessarily. That martial Tao she's cultivating was created by a cultivator of the lower worlds. How can it be compared to the dermic Taos of the immortal, Buddhist and fiend Taos that have been passed down through the ages? In my opinion, she might not even be able to attract the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation. After the news spread, it caused a huge discussion among the 8 sword peaks. Firstly, Bai Ming-Xue was considered a celebrity among the 8 sword peaks and many sword cultivators admired her secretly. Secondly, Bai Ming-Xue cultivated the martial Tao. Many sword cultivators were curious how many perfected one heavenly tribulations Bai Ming-Xue could attract after cultivating the martial Tao. Many cultivators moved one after another and headed to Carnage Sword Peak to take a look through the teleportation formations of their respective sword peaks. Yun Ting broke out of seclusion right away as well. He looked in the direction of Carnage Sword Peak and harumphed when he recalled his deal with Su Zimo 3 years ago. Fortunately, I didn't have to wait long. I want to see how far your disciple can go. When junior sister Baiming's tribulation transcendence is over, I'll fight her and beat her until she's convinced. Since you stole my sister, I'll steal your disciple as well and we'll be even. As he said that, Yun Ting set off for the teleportation formation of Extreme Sword Peak as well. At the same time, Gong Suanyu, Sword Immortal Tai Lai Yi Wuchen, Xinyu, Li Shui, Qin Zhong and Monk Ju Jian arrived at Carnage Sword Peak one after another. At that moment, the surrounding 500 kilometers of Baiming Shui's cave abode was classified as a forbidden ground. 10 Immortal King experts of Carnage Sword Peak left the mountain and guarded 10 spatial nodes in the surroundings, prohibiting anyone from entering to prevent any accidents from interfering with Baiming Shui's tribulation transcendence. Thousands of miles away the world was already filled with people. The perfected one heavenly tribulation had long begun. How's everything? Qin Zhong was the last to arrive. He looked at Wang Dong and the others and asked, which heavenly tribulation is it? It's the 3rd level right now. Wang Dong replied in a deep voice. He looked at the figure in the tribulation transcendence with a grim expression. Qin Zhong chuckled. To think that junior sister Baiming would be able to attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation even without condensing a Dao fruit. That master of hers was right after all. Wang Dong and the others did not say anything and looked at Baiming Shui in the tribulation transcendence with strange expressions. Qin Zhong followed everyone's gaze and looked at the center of the tribulation transcendence. His expression could not help but change. At that moment, it was already the 9th heavenly tribulation of the 3rd level. A green sea of lightning had already formed around Baiming Shui. It was blinding and stirred up massive waves with a terrifying might. As for Baiming Shui, she stood on the spot the entire time without moving or even drawing her weapon. Well? Qin Zhong was secretly speechless and could not help but ask, junior sister Baiming actually underwent tribulation transcendence like that? Wang Dong said, junior sister Baiming cultivates the martial Dao and her physique is indeed strong. According to what I know in the history of the 8 sword peaks, there were very few paragons who could withstand the first 3 perfected one heavenly tribulations with their bodies. Junior brother Yun of Extreme Sword Peak was almost the peak of that. As everyone discussed, the 3rd heavenly tribulation had already ended and the 4th heavenly tribulation descended. Baiming Shui still did not defend and underwent tribulation transcendence with her body. This was Su Zimo's requirement for her. The martial Dao used itself as the world to cultivate continuously. The process of tribulation transcendence was also a form of cultivation and it was a rare opportunity. This was the only way to release the full potential of her body and bloodline to the greatest extent. Boom, boom, boom. Amidst the exclamations of everyone, Baiming Shui endured the first 4 heavenly tribulations head-on. Of course it was not easy for her either. There were already some injuries on her body and she was charred from the heavenly tribulations and looked a little disheveled. In the blink of an eye, the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation descended. Baiming Shui had yet to release her divine powers, secret skills or defend with her sword. Is junior sister Baiming crazy? Qin Zhong could not help but say, if she continues like this and is severely injured, how can she defend against the subsequent heavenly tribulations? Sword Immortal Tai Lai sighed as well. Previously, junior brother Yun Ting almost died when he endured the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation with his body. Wang Dong and the others had nervous expressions and stared fixedly without saying a word. Boom, boom, boom. The 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation smashed down one after another and Baiming Shui gradually could not hold on any longer. Her flesh was lacerated by the power of the heavenly tribulation and she bled profusely. She was knocked down time and time again and struggled to stand up. The 9th heavenly tribulation of the 5th level even pierced through her chest, revealing a bowl-sized hole that was extremely shocking. Finally, the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation dissipated. As for Baiming Shui, she laid motionless in the charred pit. At that moment, the hearts of all the sword cultivators tightened. Even the 8 peak masters on the peak of Carnage Sword Peak could not help but stand up and look over with nervous expressions. Isn't junior sister Baiming too hard on herself? Yun Ting was secretly speechless. Back when he transcended the 5th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation, he also endured it head-on and almost died. Furthermore, that was with the fact that his physique and bloodline were strong to begin with. His bloodline was filled with the power of sword blood and lightning. Therefore, a portion of the power of the 5th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation was absorbed by his body and bloodline, and he was lucky enough to survive. What did junior sister Baiming have to back her? That martial Dao. Right then Baiming Xue's body moved and she crawled out of the huge pit slowly. Her face was pale but she was expressionless with a firm gaze, as though she could not feel any pain. Her wound was filled with boundless life force and the blood hole in her chest was healing rapidly. Chapter 2753 Chapter 2753 Myriad Sword Hum. Chapter 2753 Myriad Sword Hum. What a powerful life force. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the Peak Masters could not help but exclaim when they saw that. This doesn't seem like Baiming Xue's own recovery ability. Someone must have sealed a huge amount of life force in her body in advance. Who can possess such a strong life force and seal it in another person's body? Even we can't do such a thing. The 8 Peak Masters exchanged glances. Instinctively, the gaze of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak landed on the green-robed cultivator in the crowd and he murmured, "Could it be him?" To be fair, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak did not take this person from the heavenly world seriously at first. He was just a convergence perfected immortal after all. Because he was worried that Baiming Xue would be dragged down by this person, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak even looked down on him somewhat. However, when he saw that Baiming Xue had a chance of becoming a perfected immortal, the attitude of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak towards this person gradually changed. At that moment he even guessed that the person who sealed life force in Baiming Xue was Su Zhu. Of course, Su Zimo was the only one who had such methods. Su Zimo sighed gently when he saw Baiming Xue struggling to stand up. Although they both cultivated the martial Dao, Baiming Xue's physique and bloodline were way inferior to the martial Dao prime body. Firstly, the prime body was the founder of the martial Dao. Secondly, the martial spirit of the martial Dao prime body was a flame that tempered his flesh at all times. It could even smelt divine powers and secret skills and fuse them into his flesh. Thirdly, the two of them had different experiences. The body of the martial Dao prime body was not only made of flesh and blood, it was also a furnace that had smelted too many divine powers, secret skills and taboo mystic classics. As for Baiming Xue's martial spirit, it was her sword. Baiming Xue's greatest advantage was in the sword Dao. In fact, Baiming Xue's physique and bloodline were inferior even when compared to the Green Lotus True Body. Back when the Green Lotus True Body underwent the Tribulation Transcendence, he stood on the spot motionlessly and endured the first 6 Perfected One Heavenly Tribulations with his body unscathed. Furthermore, the Green Lotus True Body possessed a terrifying self-healing power. Seeing that the 6th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation was about to descend, Su Zimo shouted, "Baiming, draw your sword." He had once told Baiming Xue that the more heavenly tribulations she endured with her body, the more beneficial it would be for the cultivation of the martial Dao. However, at that moment he saw that Baiming Xue had already reached her limit. If she continued to undergo tribulation transcendence with her body, there was a high chance that she would collapse in the 6th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation. Baiming Xue turned around and looked at Su Zimo from afar with a firm and unyielding gaze, shaking her head gently. This was her choice. Boom. The 6th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation descended. Baiming Xue stomped her feet and soared into the skies. Like an unsheathed sword, she shone with a cold glint and charged towards the Heavenly Tribulation in a bedazzling manner. Boom. Baiming Xue collided with the Heavenly Tribulation and fell rapidly, landing heavily on the ground. She coughed out large mouthfuls of blood. However, she did not retreat, fear or submit. Instead, she continued to charge forward with indomitable will. This was the martial Dao. This was Baiming Xue's sword Dao. It was just like back in Baiming Town in Tianhuang mainland. Even though her dantian was shattered and her clansmen suffered and were bullied, she did not submit, admit defeat or give up. No one could shake her will. The heavenly tribulation could penetrate her chest but not her heart of the sword. At that moment the 8 Peak Masters on the mountain peak were moved. Many sword cultivators in the world felt a shock that touched the depths of their souls and their blood seemed to be burning. Many sword cultivators were convinced by her spirit of the sword Dao. Looking at the unyielding figure, they felt a long-lost feeling of gratitude and tears welled up in their eyes. This scene was familiar. It was the same way they watched Bai Mingshui go against the Sword Chi waterfall at the foot of Carnage Sword Peak stubbornly. Boom, boom, boom. Bai Mingshui fell time and time again and landed on the ground before standing up again. Her body was already in tatters and her original appearance could not be seen. However, she still did not give in and pressed forward. Boom. The 8th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level descended. The heavenly tribulation almost split Bai Mingshui into two. A gigantic wound slashed down diagonally from Bai Mingshui's shoulder blade and her internal organs spilled all over the ground in a shocking manner. Bai Mingshui lay on her back in the huge pit, her body mangled and motionless as though she was no longer breathing. The 9th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level was still being nurtured and could descend at any moment. Right then all the sword cultivators held their breaths and focused. They looked at the figure in the pit and clenched their fists instinctively, hoping for a miracle. Suddenly Bai Mingshui moved. Expressionless, she sat up slowly and placed her internal organs back into her body. The life force Su Zimo sealed in her body was almost depleted and although her wounds were still healing, the speed had slowed down. Bai Mingshui pursed her lips and used all her strength to support her broken body bit by bit. Every time she moved, her body would tremble slightly, as though she was enduring immense pain. Finally, Bai Mingshui stood up once more and looked up at the firmaments. Her body was like a sword and her gaze was sharp as one. At that moment, many sword cultivators on Carnage Sword Continent could not help but cheer. Everyone was happy for Bai Mingshui from the bottom of their hearts and celebrated for her. The peak masters of the 8 sword peaks heaved a sigh of relief as well. However, at the same time, the 8 peak masters were worried that Bai Mingshui would not be able to survive the 9th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level if she continued. Buzz, buzz. Right then, the sound of swords rang out from the direction of Myriad Sword Palace, reverberating through the world like the clash of metal. The 8 peak masters widened their eyes as though they had thought of something. Their hearts skipped a beat and they revealed looks of disbelief as they looked over instinctively. This is hum of the sword steel. The 8 peak masters exclaimed. The moment those words spread, it caused a huge commotion in the crowd. The reason why Myriad Sword Palace was known as the center of the sword world and was surrounded by the 8 sword peaks was because there was a sword stele erected in Myriad Sword Palace called the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. This Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was established by Great Emperor Zenith Heaven of the sword world in the past. It was engraved with the taboo mystic classic passed down by that great emperor. Ever since this Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was established, it had hummed a total of 2 times. The first time was when Great Emperor Zenith Heaven became a great emperor. He resonated with the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and it hummed. The second time was when Emperor Immortal Vanquishing created the 3 great sword arts when he was an immortal king. The derivation of a peerless divine power resonated with the sword stele and it hummed. And now it was the 3rd time. Bai Mingshui did not create any divine powers or secret skills nor did she advance to the emperor realm. However, the martial will and sword Dao spirit that she had just revealed was recognized by the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and a hum was produced. Immediately after, the swords on the waists, backs and even storage bags of all the sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks and the entire sword world trembled involuntarily. The hum of the sword stele drew in a myriad sword hum. The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was awakened by Bai Mingshui and let out the sword hum to cheer her on. At that moment, Bai Mingshui's aura reached its peak. Chapter 2754 Chapter 2754 Born for the Sword. Chapter 2754 Born for the Sword. After the sword hum sounded from the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele, a commotion and excitement sounded from the depths of Myriad Sword Palace and a few terrifying auras were released inadvertently. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. The 8 peak masters looked in the direction of Myriad Sword Palace with smiles and gratified expressions. The other sword cultivators could not sense it yet, but the 8 of them could sense that the Emperor experts of Myriad Sword Palace were alarmed by the commotion here. Among them, a few old fellows even woke up. Generally speaking, sword cultivators of the sword world could only enter Myriad Sword Palace to continue cultivating after reaching the Emperor realm. To think that even those few would be alarmed. The peak master of 5 elements Sword Peak lamented. The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele has only hummed a total of 3 times. How can those few be indifferent towards it? The peak master of Fiend Sword Peak said. The peak master of Tyrant Sword Peak burst into laughter. These old fellows sure can hold it in. To think that they still can't let go of their pride as emperors and are still refusing to show themselves. Even if they don't appear, they will pay attention to Bai Ming Xue's tribulation transcendence in Myriad Sword Palace and protect her. Bai Ming Xue's tribulation transcendence this time round is truly the center of attention. Even I'm looking forward to how many levels of the heavenly tribulation she can attract. To be able to obtain the recognition of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele, do you think she'll attract the 9 of Nine? The moment that was said, the hearts of the 8 peak masters skipped a beat and anticipation flashed through their eyes. The legendary 9 of Nine heavenly tribulation. They had lived for hundreds of thousands of years but had never seen the appearance of the 9 of Nine heavenly tribulation. There was an emperor expert in Myriad Sword Palace right now who once attracted the 9 of Nine heavenly tribulation. However, that was millions of years ago. Even Lin Xuanjun and Yun Ting, who were extremely talented in the Sword Dao in this generation, only attracted the 8 of Nine heavenly tribulation. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak said in a deep voice, "A few perfected 1 heavenly tribulations can't prove anything. Most of the emperor experts of the Trichiliocosm merely reached the 7 and 8 of Nine previously. It would be best if Bai Ming Xue can attract the 9 of Nine heavenly tribulation. Even if it's only at the 8 of Nine heavenly tribulation, she's still the sword cultivator with the greatest potential in this generation of the sword world." The heavenly tribulation continued. A sword hum sounded from the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele followed by the Myriad Sword hum. Bai Ming Xue welcomed the 9th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level and slashed forward with indomitable will. In everyone's eyes, Bai Ming Xue's figure seemed to have vanished and was replaced by a sword that seemed to be able to penetrate everything. Boom. Under Bai Ming Xue's persistence, she managed to endure the first 6 perfected 1 heavenly tribulations head-on with her body in the end. With the power of the first 6 levels of the heavenly tribulations, her true martial Dao body was also rapidly reconstructed. The martial Dao runes mixed with the heavenly tribulation lightning fused into her body and bloodline continuously, stimulating the potential of her body. Without giving Bai Ming Xue much time to catch her breath, the 7th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation arrived instantly. This time round, Bai Ming Xue no longer chose to defend head-on. Instead, she released the divine powers and secret skills she had learned over the years to face the 7 of Nine heavenly tribulation. Boom, boom, boom. Under the destructive lightning, a figure that emitted endless sharpness charged against the lightning continuously and challenged the heavenly tribulation, displaying an unshakable will. The 7th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation ended. However, the tribulation clouds in the sky had yet to dissipate. Unsurprisingly, the 8th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation descended. This time round, Bai Ming Xue summoned her destiny sword and revealed her comprehension of the sword Dao under countless gazes. Bai Ming Xue's martial spirit was a sword. It was as if she was born for the sword Dao. To Bai Ming Xue, there was no such thing as being one with the sword or being born with sword blood. Her existence was in itself a supreme immortal sword that could slash through the world. Every single move and stance of hers matched her sword Dao perfectly. However, the 8 of Nine heavenly tribulation was way too powerful. Back then, Yun Ting almost died under the impact of the 8 of Nine heavenly tribulation. If Su Zimo had not arrived here and used the Green Lotus bloodline to nourish Bai Ming Xue's physique and bloodline for 3 years, she would not have been able to survive. She was struck down time and time again before standing up to face the heavenly tribulation. Finally, the 8 of Nine heavenly tribulation ended. Bai Ming Xue lay on the ground, charred black. The surface of her body was cracked like the ground after a long drought and she no longer looked human. Many sword cultivators heaved a sigh of relief. It was over. Wang Dong and the others heaved a sigh of relief as well. Although Bai Ming Xue looked severely injured, it was clear that her body was still emitting life force. As long as she recuperated for a period of time, she would be able to recover. Wang Dong was concerned. Together with some sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak, he wanted to head forward to help Bai Ming Xue up. However, the Immortal King experts guarding the surroundings had grim expressions and blocked any sword cultivators from advancing. On the mountain peak, the 8 peak masters looked at the firmaments above Bai Ming Xue with grim expressions as well. Their spirit consciousnesses were strong and they could sense it even more clearly. Although the tribulation clouds dissipated after the 8 of Nine heavenly tribulation, they were showing signs of gathering again and making a comeback. The heavenly tribulation was not over yet. The 9 of Nine heavenly tribulation. The 8 peak masters exchanged glances and thought of that possibility at the same time. At that moment, the sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Continent gradually noticed something amiss as well. They raised their heads one after another and looked at the tribulation clouds that condensed once more in the sky, exclaiming, "Heavens, could it be the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation? That must be the case. Even though I'm already at the celestial being realm, I feel my heart skip a beat against the aura emitted by the tribulation clouds. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation is unprecedented. To think that I, Qin Zhong, would be lucky enough to see it in my life. Junior sister Baiming's condition is already very bad. Even the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation is so difficult. How can she survive the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation?" Wang Dong was worried. Throughout history, there were also some monster incarnates who were destroyed by the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and could not survive. In a flash, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak tore through the air. The other peak masters were confused and did not know why the peak master of Sever Sword Peak left in a sudden. Before long, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak appeared once more. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak pointed ahead and said in a deep voice, "The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation is extremely rare in this world. You shouldn't want to miss it." Beside her was a peerlessly beautiful woman with a cold expression. It was the #1 sword immortal among legacy disciples, Lin Xuanzhen. "Master, what are you doing?" Lin Xuanzhen asked indifferently. Initially she was in seclusion. However, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak barged in and forcefully brought her here. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak pointed ahead and said in a deep voice, "The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation is extremely rare in this world. You shouldn't want to miss it." Suddenly Lin Xuanzhen's heart skipped a beat. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. She knew very well what the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation stood for. It was said that a peerless divine power would descend with the 9th 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. In theory, everyone who witnessed this peerless divine power personally had a chance of cultivating it successfully. Up till now, she had only cultivated the immortal vanquishing sword to the quasi-peerless level, and it had yet to reach the level of an actual peerless divine power. She had comprehended it for many years and felt that there was something missing. If she could witness the peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword with her own eyes, she would definitely be able to comprehend its profundities and succeed. Of course, the prerequisite was that the peerless divine power that descended from the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation was the immortal vanquishing sword. BA4112660039958118620BC1679596509113369880D0A4641C980. Chapter 2755, Chapter 2755 A Sword of Frost. Chapter 2755 A Sword of Frost. I wonder what peerless divine power will descend? The peak master of Extreme Sword Peak murmured softly. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, "Peerless divine powers are extremely rare and there have only been slightly more than 10 of them since ancient times. Baiming Shui cultivates the sword Dao. As such, there's a high chance that the immortal vanquishing sword will descend." Baiming Shui. Lin Xuanzhen murmured softly. She focused on cultivating the sword Dao and rarely cared about the people and matters between the 8 sword peaks. As such, she was a little unfamiliar with that name. Lin Xuanzhen seemed to have discovered something and frowned slightly. Suddenly she asked, "Junior sister Baiming did not condense a Dao fruit. Why would a perfected 1 heavenly tribulation descend?" The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, "It's said that Baiming Shui cultivates a dermic formulation called the martial Dao that's different from the immortal, Buddhist and fiend Daos." Martial Dao? Why have I never heard of it? Lin Xuanzhen asked again. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, "This martial Dao was created by Baiming Shui's master in the lower worlds. This person is truly an anomaly. He took another path and created such a dermic Dao. To think that he could cultivate it to this extent." As the few of them spoke, the 9th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation had already descended. The first 3 heavenly tribulations of the 9th level are similar to the previous 8 levels. However, their strength has increased significantly. If you want to survive them, you have to release your bloodline phenomenon. Baiming Shui stood on the spot, recalling everything Su Zimo had told her about the 9th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation. Gradually, she tightened her grip on her sword with a determined gaze. Fight! Bai Ming-Xue flicked her sword and hummed. The blood qi in her body surged and the sound of a tsunami sounded. Immediately after, a dragon's roar and elephant's trumpeting sounded from her bloodline, shaking the world. This was the 9th transformation of the martial Tao, the Dragon-Elephant Force. Divine dragons circled and divine elephants appeared to protect Bai Ming-Xue, colliding with the first heavenly tribulation of the 9th level with an earth-shaking bang. There were millions of people in Tianhuang mainland who cultivated the martial Tao. However, no one could reach Bai Ming-Xue's achievements in the martial Tao. That was because at the beginning of Bai Ming-Xue's cultivation of the martial Tao, Su Zimo was the one who personally imparted the Tao to her, helping her build a perfect foundation. At the 6th transformation of the martial Tao, one could condense a blood qi golden core. However, Su Zimo let Bai Ming-Xue continue cultivating and only began to condense her martial spirit after cultivating the 9th transformation of the martial Tao, the Dragon-Elephant Force. If not for the firm foundation she had built back then, Bai Ming-Xue would not have been able to survive the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation now. The 2nd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level descended. The divine dragons and divine elephants were only phenomenons manifested by the martial Tao and not her bloodline phenomenon. They had already been destroyed by the 1st heavenly tribulation of the 9th level. Bai Ming-Xue channeled her blood qi to its limits and a dark and deep ocean appeared behind her, emitting a bone-chilling coldness. Bai Ming Ocean. Bai Ming-Xue released her bloodline phenomenon and endured the 2nd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level head-on. Bai Ming Ocean was shattered by the heavenly tribulation and was almost dry. Bai Ming-Xue spat out a mouthful of blood. Although more than half of the power of the heavenly tribulation had been resolved by Bai Ming Ocean, a portion of the terrifying heavenly tribulation still surged into her body. Before she could catch her breath, the 3rd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level descended. Bai Ming-Xue pursed her lips and endured the pain as she continued circulating her bloodline. A gigantic shadow appeared in the initially dry Bai Ming Ocean. Suddenly, the shadow broke out of the waters and charged towards the 3rd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level. It was a gigantic creature that blotted out the skies in midair. It opened its gigantic mouth and emitted an ancient and terrifying aura. The Kuan race. Many sword cultivators recognized the origin of the gigantic creature and exclaimed. Boom. The 3rd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level dissipated. Bai Ming-Xue's bloodline phenomenon was shattered as well and she coughed out large mouthfuls of blood. Her aura was weak and she could no longer hold on. The 4th heavenly tribulation is called the bloodline tribulation and will directly affect your bloodline. Bai Ming-Xue recalled what Su Zimo had said to her and tried her best to calm down to defend against the impact of the bloodline tribulation. Right in front of everyone, Bai Ming-Xue's body trembled continuously and she curled up, as though she was enduring immense pain. As time passed, Bai Ming-Xue's figure gradually faded and vanished strangely. What remained on the spot was a dark and deep sword. The sword emitted a strange power and no longer fought against the bloodline tribulation. Instead, it chose to devour it. This is. On the mountain peak, the expressions of the 8 peak masters on the sword peak changed with disbelief in their eyes. She comprehended a new sword Tao during the tribulation transcendence. That should be the case. However, this sword Tao coexists with her bloodline and is not perfect and stable enough. Before long, the bloodline tribulation ended. Bai Ming-Xue's figure reappeared. After the 4th bloodline tribulation, not only did her injuries not worsen, they even healed by more than half and her condition was much better. No one knew how to defend against the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation better than Su Zimo. That was because he had experienced it twice alone. He imparted his experience of the 2 tribulation transcendences to Bai Ming-Xue entirely. The following Essence Spirit Tribulation, Tao Heart Tribulation and Karma Tribulation did not pose much of a threat to Bai Ming-Xue and were defended by her one after another. It was only when the 8th Weapon Tribulation descended that Bai Ming-Xue suffered immense damage. Bai Ming-Xue's body was drenched in blood and she swayed. She merely leaned on her destiny sword and stood in a pool of blood with difficulty. There was only one final perfected 1 heavenly tribulation left. However, everyone knew that the final heavenly tribulation was the most terrifying and fatal. The pressure in the world became incomparably oppressive. On the mountain peak and in midair, all the sword cultivators held their breaths and stared fixedly at the tribulation clouds in the skies. The final heavenly tribulation was a peerless divine power and they were lucky enough to witness it. This was also an opportunity for them. In fact, the few powerful auras in Myriad Sword Palace became extremely quiet, afraid of disturbing Bai Ming Shui. Only the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was still emitting sword hums, seemingly boosting Bai Ming Shui's aura. Lin Xuanjun and Yun Ting were also looking forward to the next scene. Suddenly, peach blossoms of different colors floated down from the tribulation clouds in the sky. They were white, red and pink and emitted a faint fragrance. The fragrance was not strong, but the surrounding sword cultivators felt a little dazed when they smelled it and looked intoxicated. Even most perfected immortal sword cultivators were not spared. Only the 8 peak masters on the mountain peak had solemn expressions. They could clearly see that although the peach blossoms looked ordinary, they were condensed from sword chi and every single one of them contained terrifying lethality. If it's not the immortal vanquishing sword, what peerless divine power is it? This looks like a divine power of the sword Dao, but it doesn't seem to have appeared before. A new peerless divine power has descended. When the 8 peak masters thought of that, they were shocked. Right then, the peach blossom rain descended continuously and formed words in the sky. A sky of intoxicating flowers, a sword of frost. Everyone read it out instinctively. Zing! A sword hum sounded. Amidst the peach blossoms that filled the sky, a stunning and resplendent sword light appeared with an extremely sharp sword intent. Like lightning that tore through the night sky, it entered Bai Ming Shui's body instantly. Chapter 2756, Chapter 2756, Peerless Standoff. Chapter 2756, Peerless Standoff. The moment the sword light arrived, a torrential sword intent burst forth from within Bai Ming Shui's body and the killing intent shook the entire world. A sword that was scarlet as blood flew out from Bai Ming Shui's body and took the sword light head-on. Immortal vanquishing sword. An exclamation sounded from the crowd. On the mountain peak, the 8 peak masters were astounded as well. Although the immortal vanquishing sword was not at the level of a peerless divine power, it was already a quasi-peerless divine power. Boom. The two sword Daos collided. A moment later, the tribulation clouds dissipated. The world was silent. All the sword cultivators, including the immortal kings present and the 8 peak masters on the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, were stunned on the spot, convinced by the sword intent revealed by that sword strike. There were no words that could describe the amazement of that strike. Perhaps, everything could only be found in those words revealed. A sky of intoxicating flowers, a sword of frost. A new peerless divine power had descended upon the sword world because of Bai Ming Shui. On the mountain peak, Lin Xuanjun's calm eyes rippled as well and her heart skipped a beat. Yun Ting clenched his fists with a conflicted expression. Although Bai Ming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, that alone could not affect him much. The heavenly tribulation was only on the surface. Cultivators of the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation might not lose to those of the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation in the future. It was said that when the strongest emperor expert in the world, Demon Empress Blood Butterfly of the Great Wilderness, entered the perfected one realm, she only attracted the 5 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Generally speaking, after living beings condensed their Tao fruits, they could at least attract the 6 of 9 heavenly tribulation. However, Demon Empress Blood Butterfly was so weak back then that even the 6 of 9 heavenly tribulation did not appear. Even so, later on she still stood at the peak of the upper world and looked down on all living beings. Yun Ting was only one perfected one heavenly tribulation beneath Bai Ming Shui, that could not shake his Tao heart. However, when he saw the sword strike earlier on, he was still deeply shocked. He could not describe how terrifying that strike was. He only knew that if he was in Bai Ming Shui's shoes, he would most probably not be able to defend against that sword strike. Everyone's gazes were on Bai Ming Shui. She seemed to be in an extremely bad state. Not only was her life force weak, even her essence spirit and her consciousness was severely injured and was almost shattered. It's over. Sensing everything, many sword cultivators shook their heads and sighed. Yun Ting's eyes flashed with pity as well. Right then, a green figure flashed and arrived beside Bai Ming Shui. It was Su Zimo. Su Zimo went forward with a grim expression and carried the unconscious Bai Ming Shui, prepared to return to her cave abode. The next moment, the void at the side suddenly split open and an incomparably domineering aura descended. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak had arrived. Put her down and hand her over to me. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak stopped Su Zimo with a cold glint in his eyes and a powerful might that crushed towards Su Zimo. No. Su Zimo spoke slowly with a fearless expression. His tone was firm and unquestionable. Even against an immortal king expert, Su Zimo met his gaze without dodging at all. The jaws of the surrounding sword cultivators dropped slightly. At that moment, everyone seemed to have an illusion that Su Zimo was not at a disadvantage in terms of aura in his confrontation with the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak. Who's that? On the mountain peak, Lin Xuanjin's gaze landed on Su Zimo and she suddenly asked. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, "He's Baiming Shue's master in the lower worlds." Lin Xuanjin nodded slightly. Sigh. Suddenly the peak master of Five Elements Sword Peak sighed. Brother Lu is a little worked up because he's overly concerned. Baiming Shui is so severely injured that even her essence spirit is almost shattered. Even the emperors of Myriad Sword Palace can't do anything for her, let alone us. The peak master of Illusory Sword Peak nodded as well. If they could save her, those old fellows would have appeared a long time ago. Amit Ba. The peak master of Zen Sword Peak said, "We should step in to talk to Brother Lu lest he injures Baiming Shue's master in a moment of impulse. After all, this has nothing to do with her master." What did you say? When the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak saw that Su Zimo actually dared to oppose him, he could not help but feel enraged. The sword light in his eyes became even sharper and was about to spew out. "Can you save her?" Su Zimo asked instead with a calm expression. "I." The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak was stumped for words and was stunned on the spot. Indeed, he could not save Baiming Shui. However, he truly did not want her to die prematurely. He had to give it a try with everything he could no matter what. "Since you can't save her, don't block the way." Right then Su Zimo said, "I'll save my own disciple. No one else is to disturb me for a month." With that said, Su Zimo carried Baiming Shui towards the cave abode. When he heard that, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak could not believe it. However, a trace of hope reignited in his heart and he moved aside instinctively. In the blink of an eye, Su Zimo carried Baiming Shui and disappeared from everyone's sight. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak stood on the spot with a conflicted expression. After pondering for a long time, he took a deep look in the direction where Su Zimo and Baiming Shui left before turning to leave. On the mountain peak, Lin Xuanjin had already left and returned to Sever Sword Peak to continue her seclusion. Although she did not see the descent of the immortal vanquishing sword this time round, that new peerless divine power still shocked her greatly. She wanted to enter seclusion as soon as possible to absorb and refine her comprehension as much as possible. "Brother Lu, let's let him give it a shot." The peak master of Five Elements Sword Peak sighed. "Even if you take Baiming Shui away, you'll probably have to watch her die in front of you in the end." The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, "That's right. Even if he can't save her, Baiming Shui is still his disciple. He should be the one to send her off on her final journey." The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak was silent. He looked at Baiming Shue's cave abode from afar with a hint of anticipation. Upon returning to the cave abode, Su Zimo activated the surrounding immortal formations immediately and blocked the entire cave abode. Along the way he had already checked Baiming Shue's injuries from head to toe. Baiming Shui was indeed severely injured and her life was on the line. The most terrifying thing was that Baiming Shue's essence spirit, which was the sword soul in her consciousness, suffered a huge impact and was almost shattered. However, Su Zimo could see clearly that the final sword strike of the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation was not fatal. In fact, it left Baiming Shui with a trace of life. This was completely different from the 2 tribulation transcendences he underwent back then. Back when he attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation twice, the final heavenly tribulations were completely aimed at destroying him. However, when the sword light from the peerless divine power of the sword Tao entered Baiming Shue's body at the last moment, it left a trace of life to save her life temporarily. As long as there was a trace of life, Su Zimo had a way to save Baiming Shui. Relying on the bloodline of the grade 12 creation Green Lotus, if he used the Lotus Life Finger for a month, he could heal Baiming Shue's injuries completely. As for the sword soul injuries that were the most difficult to resolve, he had some Sakura fruits in his storage bag that he could feed her. If one won't do, he would use 2. If he chanted the text from the Prajna Nirvana Sutra at the same time to nourish Bai Ming Xue's sword soul, there was a 70% chance he could heal her completely. The Grade 12 creation green lotus that possessed an incomparably rich life force was the only possibility of saving Bai Ming Xue, who was on the brink of death. Upon recovering, Bai Ming Xue had a chance of comprehending two peerless divine powers. Chapter 2757, Chapter 2757, Return of the Sword Arts. Chapter 2757, Return of the Sword Arts. After the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation dissipated, many sword cultivators returned to their respective sword peaks. This observation allowed most sword cultivators to gain many new insights into the sword Tao. If anyone in the world could attract the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, it would be a rare opportunity for the cultivators of the entire world. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the 8 peak masters gathered here and recalled the scene of Bai Ming Xue undergoing tribulation transcendence earlier on. They sighed endlessly. If I'm not wrong, Bai Ming Xue should have the original ancient scrolls of the 3 great sword arts in her storage bag, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak said in a deep voice. The others were not surprised when they heard that. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation was way too powerful. Not only was Bai Ming Xue's body severely injured, her storage bag was almost shattered as well. Through the shattered storage bag, the 8 peak masters sensed the auras of the 3 sword arts. Furthermore, it was the most primitive and purest sword chi of the 3 great sword arts. The peak master of 5 elements Sword Peak nodded as well. Although her immortal vanquishing sword has yet to reach the level of a peerless divine power, it's at the quasi-peerless level. There's no mistake about that divine charm and sword intent she possessed. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak said, I've been paying attention to her cultivation. At the very least, she was still unable to fuse the 3 great sword arts and condense the immortal vanquishing sword 3 years ago. The reason why she could cultivate the immortal vanquishing sword should be because she read the original ancient scrolls of the 3 great sword arts. The peak master of Illusory Sword Peak lamented, Bai Ming Xue is truly blessed. To think that she could obtain the first version of the 3 great sword arts. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak had a puzzled expression. However, she has been cultivating in Carnage Sword Peak for the past 3 years and has never left. How could she have obtained the 3 sword arts? 3 years ago. The peak masters of the 8 sword peaks exchanged glances and thought of the same person at the same time. 3 years ago was when Su Zhu of the heavenly world arrived. Could he have imparted it to Bai Ming Xue? In that case, he should have cultivated the 3 great sword arts as well. To be able to impart the first version of the 3 great sword arts to Bai Ming Xue, it's clear that he values her immensely. Even personal disciples might not be able to see the first versions of cultivation techniques like the 3 great sword arts. Furthermore, Su Zimo handed the first version of the 3 great sword arts to Bai Ming Xue right away. And no matter what, the first version of the 3 great sword arts has been lost for many years. It's finally back in the hands of a cultivator of the sword world in this generation. If Su Zhu really imparted the 3 great sword arts to Bai Ming Xue, brother, Lu, you should meet him and thank him in person. The significance of the return of the 3 great sword arts to the sword world is way too great. In reality, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak knew the importance of this matter as well. However, he was an immortal king after all, and Su Zhu was only a perfected immortal. He was still a little prideful and resistant to the idea of that. Furthermore, Bai Ming Xue's fate was unknown. Even if the 3 great sword arts were returned, he was not in the mood. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak said, that's all speculation. If the 3 great sword arts were really imparted to Bai Ming Xue by this person, it's nothing for me to thank him. If he can save Bai Ming Xue, it won't even be a problem for me to prepare a huge gift and hand it to him personally, let alone thank him. This was a monster incarnate of the Sword Tao who attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and brought about the birth of a new peerless divine power. As long as she could survive, she would definitely be the hope of the sword world in the future. That was something that no gift could be exchanged for. Time flew, and in the blink of an eye, a month had passed. During this period of time, almost all the sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks were discussing the previous 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Wang Dong and the other sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak took turns to stand guard outside Bai Ming Xue's cave abode every day, hoping for some news to come from inside. However, the cave abode was closed the entire time and it was silent inside. Although the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak did not appear, he would look in that direction from time to time. On this day, the door of the cave abode that had been closed for a month opened slowly and a slender figure walked out from the depths of the cave abode. The sword cultivators guarding outside the cave abode looked over immediately and their eyes widened in shock when they saw the figure walking out. Bai Ming Shui was out of seclusion. The news swept through the 8 sword peaks like a violent storm, causing a huge commotion. Everyone saw Bai Ming Shui's injuries that day. Even Immortal King experts were helpless. No one expected Bai Ming Shui to come back to life and recover fully. When Wang Dong and the others received the news, they came to congratulate her immediately. Bai Ming Shui's advancement to the Perfected One realm meant that she had already become a legacy disciple of the Sword World. Them. On the mountain peak, Lu Yun, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak, burst into laughter excitedly. "Ha, the heavens are truly blessing our Sword World." Lu Yun looked at the withered lotus flowers on the mountain peak and murmured, "Senior Immortal Vanquishing, did you see that? Our Sword World now has a monster incarnate who attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation." Bai Ming Shui's tribulation transcendence had already ended. However, the withered lotus flowers on the mountain peak did not recover their vitality as he had expected. Even so, Lu Yun was delighted when he saw Bai Ming Shui return unscathed. At the same time, the peak masters of the other sword peaks received the news as well. Seems like Carnage Sword Peak is going to rise in this generation. With the appearance of Bai Ming Shui from Carnage Sword Peak and the return of the 3 great sword arts to the Sword World, Lu Yun will probably wake up laughing in his dreams. That might not be the case. In this generation, Extreme Sword Peak has Yun Ting and Sever Sword Peak has Lin Xuanzhen. It's still unknown who can walk further on the Sword Dao. Among the legacy disciples of the 8 sword peaks, Bai Ming Shui, Yun Ting and Lin Xuanzhen have all cultivated the immortal vanquishing sword to the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. I wonder who will be the first to comprehend the true immortal vanquishing sword. Although Bai Ming Shui had obtained the peerless divine power of a sword of frost, it did not mean that she had completely comprehended it. Comprehending and mastering a peerless divine power was as difficult as ascending the heavens. Bai Ming Shui still had to continue cultivating and comprehending. She needed time to settle down and an opportunity. It could only be said that she was the sword cultivator with the highest chance of comprehending a sword of frost. On the mountain peak, Lu Yun looked at Bai Ming Shui, who had just walked out of her cave abode and was receiving the congratulations of many sword cultivators in silence. A moment later, he suddenly sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness, asking Bai Ming Shui to come to the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. Firstly, he wanted to test if Bai Ming Shui could revive the lotus flowers on the mountain peak. Secondly, he had to ask about the matter of the 3 great sword arts. Before long, Bai Ming Shui ascended the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. This was the first time she was here. A hint of surprise flashed through her eyes as she looked at the large patch of withered lotus flowers around her. Disappointment flashed through Lu Yun's eyes. There was no feedback from the surrounding lotus flowers. Lu Yun put that matter aside for the time being and asked with a smile, "Bai Ming Shui, there's something I want to confirm. Did your master impart the 3 great sword arts to you?" At the mention of the 3 great sword arts and Su Zimo, Bai Ming Shui suddenly looked wary. Lu Yun smiled. "Don't be nervous. Since the 3 great sword arts are with you, they belong to you. No one can take them away without your permission. As for your master, I won't hurt him either. In fact, if he was the one who imparted the 3 great sword arts to you, I'll have to prepare a gift to thank him in person." Chapter 2758 Chapter 2758, Battle of Monster Incarnates. Chapter 2758, Battle of Monster Incarnates. Bai Ming Shui knew that she could not hide this from the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak. She also believed that the other party would keep his promise and not harm Su Zimo. Only then did she not. "The 3 great sword arts were indeed imparted to me by master." "Indeed." Lu Yun nodded slightly in silence. In that case he should indeed meet Su Zhu and thank him in person. However, he was in a dilemma as to what gift to prepare. If the gift was insignificant, it would seem impolite, as though he did not take this matter seriously at all. However, Su Zhu was not from the sword world after all. He was just Bai Ming Shui's master from the lower worlds. If the gift was too significant, it would be inappropriate too. Lu Yun couldn't think of a way to prepare a sincere and appropriate thank you gift. Of course, he had even more important matters to discuss with Su Zhu. Biming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, which even descended with a new peerless divine power of the sword Tao. During the tribulation transcendence, she attracted the resonance of the Zenith heaven sword Stele to help her. It was no exaggeration to say that Biming Shui was one of the most important legacy disciples in the sword world. Although she had just entered the perfected one realm, her status in the sword world was definitely not inferior to Lin Xuanjun and Yun Ting in the hearts of the experts. Right now, Biming Shui was a convergence perfected immortal. Her master, Su Zhu, should have just broken through to the celestial being realm. The two of them were of similar cultivation realms. In fact, in Lu Yun's opinion, if he removed the restrictions that disallowed cultivators from different cultivation realms from sparring, Biming Shui would definitely be able to defeat her master. This monster incarnate of the sword world who transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and had a chance of comprehending 2 peerless divine powers could definitely fight above her level. That way the relationship between the two of them would seem awkward. In Lu Yun's opinion, Su Zhu was no longer qualified to continue imparting the Tao to Biming Shui. Biming Shui's master had to be an immortal king at least. The horizons and knowledge of immortal kings and their understanding of Dharmic Tao were far from what a perfected immortal could compare to. Even ordinary immortal kings were not suitable. Only a peak immortal king, a peak master, such as himself could be qualified to be Biming Shui's master. Furthermore, Biming Shui cultivated the sword Tao after all. Even if Su Zhu cultivated the 3 great sword arts, how could he compare to her in the sword Tao? If that was the case, what could this person teach Biming Shui? Of course, Lu Yun could not say that in front of Biming Shui. He could vaguely sense that Biming Shui was extremely respectful and reliant on Su Zhu. He wanted to make use of this opportunity to talk to Su Zhu about this. If this person withdrew voluntarily, it would be a better choice for Biming Shui. Peak Master, if there's nothing else, I'll take my leave first. Biming Shui said when she saw Lu Yun deep in thought for a long time. Yes. Lu Yun answered before asking casually, where are you going? Extreme Sword Peak. Biming Shui said indifferently. As though he sensed something, Lu Yun caught a hint of sword intent from Biming Shui and asked, why are you going to Extreme Sword Peak? Biming Shui said, I have a battle arranged with Yun Ting. I'm going to settle it now. Well? Lu Yun hesitated for a moment. Biming Shui, you've just transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and your injuries have just recovered. You haven't cultivated in the perfected one realm yet. I suggest that you cultivate in the perfected one realm for a period of time and familiarize yourself with the battles between perfected immortals. Biming Shui shook her head gently. The reason why I'm fighting Yun Ting is because I want to use him to test my sword and familiarize myself with the battles of perfected immortals. Lu Yun said helplessly, you don't have to look for Yun Ting right away if you just want someone to test your sword. You can do it with a weaker opponent. In Lu Yun's opinion, although Biming Shui had passed the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, it was hard to say who would win in her fight against Yun Ting. Yun Ting's talent in the sword Tao was also rare in the world. Furthermore, Yun Ting had obtained many sword Tao inheritances and had already cultivated every single sword Tao to greater mastery. Also, Yun Ting had cultivated for a much longer time in the perfected one realm than Biming Shui. Biming Shui had just entered the perfected one realm and her greatest advantage was that she had a chance to comprehend 2 peerless divine powers in the future. If she looked for Yun Ting now, it would be equivalent to wasting this advantage. More importantly, there was another worry in Lu Yun's heart. Biming Shui cultivated the martial Tao after all and had not even condensed a Tao fruit. Although she had entered the perfected one realm, what chance did Biming Shui have of winning against Yun Ting, a pure perfected immortal with a Tao fruit? As though she could read Lu Yun's concerns, Biming Shui said indifferently, I entered the perfected one realm as a martial Tao cultivator. Since I want to fight, I have to find the strongest among my peers. I'm sure many fellow disciples of the 8 Sword Peaks want to see the combat strength of the martial Tao at the perfected one realm as well. In reality, that was also the case. After knowing that Biming Shui had come out of seclusion, the greatest suspense in the hearts of the sword cultivators was how strong she was after cultivating the martial Tao and entering the perfected one realm. After all, the heavenly tribulation was only external. If Biming Shui's combat strength could not be ranked in the top 10 among her peers, so what if she attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation? It would probably only prove that the martial Tao was worthless. When Lu Yun saw that Biming Shui was determined to leave, he could not persuade her further and could only give her a few reminders. He then explained some of the trump cards that Yun Ting had revealed previously to Bai Ming Shui. After Bai Ming Shui heard that, she turned around and headed towards the teleportation formation, heading straight for Extreme Sword Peak. Lu Yun looked at Bai Ming Shui's back view in silence. In Lu Yun's understanding, the martial Dao was only a dermic Dao created by a cultivator of the lower worlds after all. It was incomplete and could not compare to dermic Daos like the immortal, Buddhist and fiend Daos that had been passed down through the ages. If the martial Dao was really strong, why did Su Zhu, who created the martial Dao, stop cultivating it? Lu Yun had long observed Su Zhu in secret. Su Zhu's cultivation clearly belonged to the immortal, Buddhist and fiend lineages, and there was a Dao fruit in his consciousness. Perhaps it's good as well if Bai Ming Shui loses. Lu Yun thought about it. That way he had even more reason to persuade Su Zhu to let go and let Bai Ming Shui become his disciple. News of Bai Ming Shui heading to Extreme Sword Peak to challenge Yun Ting spread like wildfire. The 8 sword peaks that had just calmed down for a month were in an uproar once more. For many sword cultivators, a battle between 2 peerless monster incarnates of the sword world was much better than the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Hurry, let's go to Extreme Sword Peak. Bai Ming Shui and Yun Ting are about to fight. Bai Ming Shui is way too domineering. She wants to spar with junior brother Yun the moment she advances to the perfected one realm. Although Bai Ming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, she doesn't have a Dao fruit. She might not have a high chance of winning against junior brother Yun. Many sword cultivators discussed and made use of the teleportation formations to head towards Extreme Sword Peak. Junior sister Bai Ming is way too anxious. When Wang Dong found out about this, he could not help but feel worried. He shook his head and sighed. If she cultivates for hundreds or thousands of years and has some comprehension of a sword of frost, even only at the level of a quasi-peerless divine power, she has a 70% chance of winning against junior brother Yun. But now, both of them are in control of immortal vanquishing sword at the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. However, junior sister Bai Ming has just entered the perfected one realm. She doesn't have any advantage at all. When the perfected immortal experts of the 8 sword peaks, Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu, Xinyu, Qin Zhong and the others heard that, they moved as well. Instantly, sword cultivators filled Extreme Sword Peak. The battle between 2 peerless monster incarnates of the sword world was the center of attention. Chapter 2759 Chapter 2759, Won't Die. Chapter 2759, Won't Die. The battle between the 2 monster incarnates attracted the attention of countless sword cultivators. In the sword world, it was not easy to witness a battle between top monster incarnates. For example, Lin Xuanjun was completely unrivaled among her peers. As for Yun Ting and Lin Xuanjun, their cultivation realms were significantly different and they could not spar. The reason why this unprecedented battle between 2 people of the same cultivation realm could take place was because Bai Ming Shui suddenly attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and advanced to the perfected one realm. This battle was not only between Bai Ming Shui and Yun Ting. Countless sword cultivators wanted to see what combat strength Bai Ming Shui could unleash at the perfected one realm with the martial Dao she cultivated. The 8 sword peaks were in an uproar, but Bai Ming Shui's cave abode was abnormally quiet. Su Zimo did not join in the fun. He knew Bai Ming Shui and Yun Ting too well and in his opinion, there was no doubt about the outcome. For the past 3 years he had spent most of his energy on Bai Ming Shui. Now that Bai Ming Shui had entered the true martial realm, he was relieved and prepared to continue cultivating and comprehending dermic Daos. His cultivation realm increased rapidly and had already caught up, surpassing Yun Ting. However, in reality he was far from reaching the upper limit of his combat strength. Up till now, Su Zimo had already cultivated the divine powers of the immortal vanquishing sword, Buddha Dragon Elephant, 6 paths of reincarnation, fleeting moment, 4 heads 8 arms and 6 tusk divine strength to a quasi-peerless level. However, if he wanted to cultivate a true peerless divine power, he still had to continue comprehending them. Although there was only a difference of a single word, the power released was worlds apart. If Su Zimo could cultivate those divine powers into peerless divine powers, his combat strength would reach its peak. At that time, with the augmentation of 6 tusk divine strength and 4 heads 8 arms, coupled with a few peerless divine powers, it was difficult for him to predict what kind of power he could unleash. Throughout history, no one could master so many peerless divine powers at the same time. More than half a day had passed since Baiming Shui left. Finally, a sound came from the cave abode's door. Before long, a figure walked in slowly. Su Zimo opened his eyes and looked over. Baiming Shui's clothes were a little messy and blood-stained. Her face was slightly pale and her aura was weak. It was clear that she had expended a lot of energy in this battle and had fought extremely hard. However, Baiming Shui's expression was still calm and her gaze was sharp like a sword. "You won?" Su Zimo asked. "I won." Baiming Shui nodded. The master and disciple asked and answered without saying anything else. Su Zimo had long expected this and naturally did not ask further or be curious. Given Baiming Shui's personality, she would not show any excitement even if she defeated Yun Ting. Su Zimo closed his eyes and was about to continue cultivating when his heart skipped a beat. He asked curiously, "Is Yun Ting all right?" Baiming Shui paused and was silent for a moment before saying, "He won't die." Silence returned to Baiming Shui's cave abode. Su Zimo comprehended his dermic daos while Baiming Shui recuperated quietly. However, Extreme Sword Peak seemed to have exploded at that moment and was filled with commotion. Baiming Shui had already returned to her cave abode, but there were still a large number of sword cultivators gathered on Extreme Sword Peak who did not leave for a long time. The battle between the two monster incarnates lasted for more than 4 hours. Everyone witnessed the entire process and the shock on their faces did not dissipate. The killing power of the sword Dao displayed by Baiming Shui and Yun Ting during their battle was an eye-opener for everyone present. At the beginning of the battle, perhaps because she was not familiar with the battle between perfected immortals, Baiming Shui was at a disadvantage and was suppressed by Yun Ting the entire time. However, as time passed, Baiming Shui gradually broke free from her disadvantage. At the end of the battle, Baiming Shui counterattacked domineeringly and suppressed Yun Ting completely. In the end, Yun Ting was knocked unconscious by Baiming Shui. Sword Immortal Tai Lai and the other peak-perfected immortals carried him down before the battle ended. Yun Ting is too pitiful. His face was beaten so badly that he doesn't even resemble a human anymore. Junior sister Baiming is way too ruthless. Why does it feel like she has a deep grudge against junior brother Yun? As expected of the monster incarnate who attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, she suppressed senior brother Yun the moment she entered the perfected one realm. Is this the martial Dao? It's way too strong. Even junior brother Yun's powerful sword blood can't suppress junior sister Baiming's blood chi. The sword intent contained in junior sister Baiming's blood chi is clearly even more terrifying. However, she doesn't seem to have completely mastered it. How do I cultivate the martial Dao? I wonder if it's too late for me to cultivate the martial Dao now. The outcome of this battle exceeded the expectations of most sword cultivators and caused a huge commotion among the 8 sword peaks. Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu, Qin Zhong and the other peak-perfected immortals had conflicted expressions and were filled with emotions. Wang Dong smiled bitterly. To think that junior sister Baiming's combat strength would still be so terrifying without a Dao fruit. Previously, I even persuaded her repeatedly not to cultivate the martial Dao. Now that I think about it, I'm really ashamed. Qin Zhong grinned and clicked his tongue. Junior sister Baiming is way too ruthless. She's already invincible among her peers the moment she advanced to the perfected one realm. Gong Suanyu lamented as well. That's right. If junior sister Baiming comprehends the peerless divine power of a sword of frost in the future, junior brother Yun will be even more inferior to her. It's not just junior brother Yun. Xinyu said, if junior sister Baiming's cultivation realm catches up to ours, we'll probably not be her match either. On the peak of Extreme Sword Peak. Even I'm a little curious about what the martial Dao is now. From my observations, the martial Dao focuses on the cultivation of the physique and bloodline. Baiming Shui's physique and bloodline are so strong that no one of the same cultivation realm can match her. With such a physique and bloodline, coupled with her sword soul, sword Dao and heart of the sword, Baiming Shui is like a pure and flawless immortal sword. Congratulations, brother Lu. The peak masters cupped their fists. Carnage Sword Peak will have a chance of leading the 8 sword peaks with Baiming Shui around. Lu Yun was already overjoyed in his heart, but he still pretended to be calm on the surface and nodded slightly. She has just entered the perfected one realm after all. She's still far from it. Now that Baiming Shui has become a perfected immortal, you can officially take her in as a disciple, brother Lu. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, Baiming Shui's talent in the sword Dao is unparalleled. You have to teach her well. At the mention of that, Lu Yun shook his head gently. Baiming Shui has no intention of becoming my disciple yet. She seems to still want to cultivate with Suzhu. How can that be? The peak master of Fiend Sword Peak frowned. Suzhu's cultivation is similar to Baiming Shui's. Wouldn't he just be dragging her genius down? This is not going to be easy. Lu Yun said in a deep voice. No matter what, Baiming Shui attained her current achievements by cultivating the martial Tao he created. Furthermore, this person even saved Baiming Shui from the verge of death and imparted the first version of the 3 great sword arts to her. From a certain perspective, he's a benefactor to our entire sword world. It would seem rude if I asked him to leave Baiming Shui. Chapter 2760 Chapter 2760, Seeing Through the Mortal World. Chapter 2760, Seeing Through the Mortal World. In the blink of an eye, half a year had passed since the battle between Baiming Shui and Yun Ting. For the past half a year, Su Zimo had been in seclusion in Baiming Shui's cave abode. He enjoyed a rare period of peace after arriving at the sword world. During this period no one came to challenge him. On this day, a spirit consciousness fluctuation came from outside the cave abode. Although Su Zimo sensed it, the spirit consciousness fluctuation was a little weak. He remained in a meditative state and did not wake up. Brother Su, Brother Su. After a while, the spirit consciousness fluctuation spread in again cautiously. Yun Ting. Su Zimo opened his eyes. He did not know what Yun Ting was doing here, but he still channeled his spirit consciousness and opened the door of the cave abode. When Yun Ting saw the door of the cave abode open, he did not walk in. Instead, he looked inside from the entrance of the cave abode, looking for something. Su Zimo raised his voice. Brother Yun, what's wrong? Why not come in for a chat? Yun Ting coughed gently and sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness. Brother Su, is your disciple inside? Baiming Shui. Su Zimo said, she's not around. She went to Myriad Sword Palace to cultivate. After Baiming Shui became a legacy disciple, she had the chance to head to Myriad Sword Palace and cultivate before the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele to comprehend the taboo mystic classic of the sword world, the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. The Zenith Heaven Sword Classic was imprinted on the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. In the sword world, the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic did not belong to anyone. Back then, Great Emperor Zenith Heaven had once passed down an ancient rule that as long as a legacy disciple of the sword world swore not to impart the sword classic privately or betray the sword world, they could come to the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic to comprehend the sword Tao. It was also because of Great Emperor Zenith Heaven's ancient rule that the sword world was one of the strongest worlds in the past few eras. Everyone who read the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic comprehended different sword Taos according to their different experiences, physiques, bloodlines and cultivation techniques in the past. From that, the 8 most powerful sword Taos of the sword world were derived, creating the current 8 sword peaks. Oh. When he heard that Baiming Shui was not inside, Yun Ting heaved a sigh of relief. As though it was a load off his shoulders, he relaxed and swaggered into the cave abode. What's the matter, Brother Yun? Su Zimo asked. Just as Yun Ting was about to speak, he suddenly noticed Su Zimo's cultivation realm. His eyes widened and he cried out, your cultivation speed is way too fast. You're already at the celestial being realm? Su Zimo nodded. It's been half a year. During the tribulation transcendence, Yun Ting's attention was on Baiming Shui and he did not notice that Su Zimo had already broken through. Advancement in the perfected one realm was much more difficult than the black, earth and heaven essence realms. Not only did it require a large amount of heaven and earth essence chi and cultivation resources, it also required a new comprehension of the world. Even with his talent and specialization in the sword Tao, Yun Ting had yet to cultivate to the peak of the convergence realm. However, Su Zimo was already at the celestial being realm. Yun Ting had always treated Su Zimo as his opponent. Even after being defeated by Su Zimo twice, he was not discouraged. However, his loss to Baiming Shui half a year ago had indeed dealt him a considerable blow. Now that he saw that Su Zimo's cultivation realm had already surpassed his heart suffered another blow. The previous 2 times Su Zimo defeated him, Su Zimo's cultivation realm was lower than his. Furthermore, Su Zimo did not release his full strength. At the very least, he did not release the blood chi of the creation green lotus. Yun Ting's chances were even less if they had fought at the same cultivation realm. But now, Su Zimo's cultivation realm was even higher than his. This meant that there was no way he could defeat Su Zimo. No matter how proud and conceited Yun Ting was, he could not help but feel discouraged. Su Zimo smiled and changed the topic. Are you here to spar with Baiming? He thought that Yun Ting must have asked about Baiming Xue's whereabouts because he wanted to spar with her. Furthermore, Yun Ting was belligerent by nature. He would definitely not be willing to admit defeat after losing to Baiming Xue in front of everyone and would find an opportunity to fight again. Unexpectedly, when Yun Ting heard the words spar with Baiming, he shuddered and said hurriedly, I'm not looking for her. I'm not sparring with her. Well? Su Zimo was stunned when he saw Yun Ting's resistance. Yun Ting was so belligerent and conceited. He actually did not want to regain his dignity after losing once. He had defeated Yun Ting twice, but Yun Ting was unconvinced and wanted to spar with him for the third time. Yet, Baiming Xue managed to subdue Yun Ting in one go. Su Zimo looked at Yun Ting with a fake smile and asked, Didn't you want to court Baiming? No, no, no. Yun Ting shook his head like a rattled drum and said with lingering fear, That crazy woman. The moment he said that, he realized that it was inappropriate. He coughed gently and corrected himself. That disciple of yours is way too fierce. I can't deal with her. Tvi had to recuperate for 2 months just after fighting with her. If we become Dao companions in the future, it'll be terrible. I'm afraid I won't be able to live past next year. Su Zimo. Even after half a year, Yun Ting's face was still filled with deep fear. Suddenly, Su Zimo regretted not watching the battle personally. He did not know what happened in that battle between the two of them to give Yun Ting such a huge psychological trauma. Su Zimo consoled, Baiming is not the only woman in the sword world. You can look for other women. No thanks. Yun Ting waved it off and winced. Women are all the same. They're terrifyingly fierce. Although my sister is usually quiet and gentle, she's ruthless when she goes crazy. It's best to just cultivate the sword Dao. I won't have such thoughts in the future. I should just focus on cultivating with my sword. Brother Su, this tribulation is probably a test from the heavens for me. It reminds me that I should focus on cultivating the sword Dao and not let my thoughts run wild. Yun Ting lamented, as though he had seen through the mortal world and was enlightened. Su Zimo had a strange expression. He could actually sense a Buddhist Zen aura from Yun Ting. Well? Su Zimo muttered internally. Could Baiming Xue have beaten Yun Ting into thoughts of asceticism? If Yunju knew about this, who knew what she would think? Right then, a voice sounded from outside the door. Young friend Su Zhu, I'm the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak, Lu Yun. I'm here to visit. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak. Su Zimo and Yun Ting exchanged glances in confusion, not knowing why this immortal king expert had come to visit. Please come in. Su Zimo stood up and welcomed Lu Yun into his cave abode. When Lu Yun saw Yun Ting, he smiled and nodded slightly. Peak Master Lu, do you need me to leave? Yun Ting bowed and asked. Lu Yun hesitated for a moment. There's no need for that. Thereafter, he turned to look at Su Zimo and cupped his fists slightly, saying in a deep voice, I'm here this time round to thank you, young friend Su Zhu. Senior, you're being too polite. Why are you thanking me? Su Zimo asked. Lu Yun said, Thank you for imparting Baiming Xue the martial Dao, young friend. You nurtured such a peerless genius and even saved her from death. Chapter 2761 Chapter 2761, A Gift of Thanks. Chapter 2761, A Gift of Thanks. In truth, Su Zimo had always been an outsider in the years he came to the sword world. However, the people of the sword world had always treated him with respect. As an immortal king expert, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak was even willing to personally thank him for Baiming Xue. Even if some sword cultivators were dissatisfied with him, they would only openly challenge him. Even if they lost, there were no plots or schemes, nor would they invite any experts to take revenge for them. Due to the upright atmosphere of the sword world, it nurtured so many open and magnanimous sword cultivators. Su Zimo smiled. Senior, you're being too polite. As Baiming's master, these are my responsibilities. Lu Yun nodded slightly and pondered for a moment. He looked at Su Zimo and said, Young friend Su Zhu, there's something that might be a little presumptuous. I wonder if Senior, feel free to speak. Su Zimo said. Young friend, you're straightforward. In that case, I won't beat around the bush. Lu Yun said, Biming Shui has already become a perfected immortal and your cultivation realm is only slightly higher than hers. I think it would be better for her if an immortal king expert imparted the Tao to her. Of course you will still be Biming Shui's master. There's no doubt about that. Su Zimo shook his head gently. Biming Shui cultivates the martial Tao. Even emperor experts might not be able to guide her on the martial Tao, let alone immortal king experts. Lu Yun said, however, if I'm not wrong, you're not cultivating the martial Tao either, young friend. Yes. Su Zimo nodded. However, I'm the only one who can guide her in the martial Tao. Lu Yun hesitated. In reality, there were other reasons why he wanted to insist on his stance. However, when he saw that Su Zimo's tone was firm and difficult to sway, it would seem rude if he continued persuading. Lu Yun smiled. I was just asking casually. I hope you won't take it to heart, young friend. Naturally, Su Zimo did not mind. Lu Yun was doing this out of goodwill because he wanted Biming Shui to become stronger. However, it was true that others could not guide Biming Shui in the martial Tao. Lu Yun said, by the way, I'm here to thank you as a token of Carnage Sword Peak's sincerity. I've also prepared a thank you gift for you, young friend. I hope you'll accept it. Yun Ting was secretly speechless. As a peak master and a peak immortal king, Lu Yun was already very sincere by thanking him in person. To think that he even prepared a thank you gift. Senior, you're too polite. Su Zimo was about to decline when Lu Yun waved his hand gently. Young friend, don't be in a hurry to decline. Please listen to me. Young friend, I already know that you imparted the 3 great sword arts to Biming Shui. I believe you've already cultivated the 3 great sword arts as well. Su Zimo had no intention of hiding this matter to begin with. When he saw that Biming Shui did not suffer in the sword world and was valued instead, he had already planned to impart the 3 great sword arts to her. From a certain perspective, it was equivalent to the return of the 3 great sword arts to the sword world. Lu Yun continued, the owner of the 3 great sword arts, Emperor Immortal Vanquishing, was once the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak. Back then he left all his sword intent on Carnage Sword Peak. The thank you gift I prepared for you is a chance to experience the sword intent of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing by going to the back of Carnage Sword Peak. As for how much you can comprehend, that will depend on your own ability. Of course, there's a prerequisite. You can't impart the sword Tao of Carnage Sword Peak to outsiders in private. A chance to experience Emperor Immortal Vanquishing's sword intent. Su Zimo was tempted. This was a rare opportunity for him. Brother Su, what are you waiting for? Agree quickly. At the side, Yun Ting sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness hurriedly. Under normal circumstances, those who are not from the sword world would not have the chance to experience the sword intents of the 8 sword peaks. This thank you gift is filled with sincerity. Don't worry, you don't have to have any reservations. People of the sword world do things openly and won't plot against you. At the very least, they won't harm you. Su Zimo agreed with Yun Ting. As a peak master and an immortal king expert, there was no need for Lu Yun to go through so much trouble to deal with him. However, he had a nagging feeling that Lu Yun seemed to have another motive behind the thank you gift. Lu Yun continued, young friend, you will definitely gain some insights after sensing the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal Vanquishing since you've cultivated the 3 great sword arts. In the future, you can also guide Biming Shui in the Carnage Sword Tao. All right. Su Zimo no longer declined and agreed right away. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. Apart from Lu Yun who was not around, the other 7 peak masters were gathered here, sipping tea and chatting. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, I heard that Brother Lu went to give Su Zhu a gift. The peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak smiled. That's right. The thank you gift that Brother Lu prepared is very meaningful. What do you mean? The peak master of Tyrant Sword Peak was puzzled. The peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak explained, he's allowing Su Zhu to head to the back of Carnage Sword Peak to sense the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal Vanquishing. It's very sincere of him indeed. However, unless one is a monster incarnate of the sword Tao, how can ordinary cultivators comprehend the essence of the Carnage sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal Vanquishing? Although Su Zhu has cultivated the 3 great sword arts, can he compare to Biming Shui in the sword Tao? Biming Shui has already cultivated the Immortal Vanquishing sword to a quasi-peerless divine power level. Even after sensing the sword intent of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing, she could not break through. How much can that Suzhou comprehend? The other peak masters nodded as well. As long as it was a sword cultivator of Carnage Sword Peak, they would have a chance to sense Emperor Immortal vanquishing sword intent. However, after so many years, how many sword cultivators could comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword? On the other hand, Lin Xuanzhen of Sever Sword Peak and Yun Ting of Extreme Sword Peak managed to cultivate the Immortal vanquishing sword to a quasi-peerless level. The Peak Master of Illusory Sword Peak said, "If Su Zhu senses nothing, he will also understand that he has no right to guide Baiming Shui in the Sword Dao. Brother Lu has put in a lot of thought into this thank you gift." The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak said, "If Su Zhu can realize his shortcomings and withdraw voluntarily, it can be considered as preserving his dignity as well." The Peak Master of Zen Sword Peak said, "Speaking of which, among the legacy disciples of this generation, Lin Xuanzhen, Baiming Shui and Yun Ting have all comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword to a quasi-peerless level. I believe that with their talent, the three of them will be able to comprehend the true Immortal vanquishing sword in the end. However, I wonder who can control this peerless divine power first. Why don't we make bets?" Suddenly the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak was interested. "I'll bet on Lin Xuanzhen." After all, Lin Xuanzhen's cultivation realm far surpassed Baiming Shui and Yun Ting's. She indeed had a better chance of comprehending the Immortal vanquishing sword first. Apart from the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak, 4 other Peak Masters of the 7 placed their bets on Lin Xuanzhen. Only one of them thought highly of Baiming Shui and the other thought highly of Yun Ting. Haha. The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak laughed. "We'll count Brother Lu in when he returns." As everyone chatted and laughed, 3 figures sped towards Carnage Sword Peak from afar. Their leader was none other than Lu Yun. Behind him were Su Zimo and Yun Ting. Chapter 2762 Chapter 2762, Carnage Sword Intent. Chapter 2762, Carnage Sword Intent. A large number of sword cultivators were gathered beside the sword cleansing pool. Ever since Baiming Shui transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, many sword cultivators wanted to follow her cultivation method and cultivate nearby. At the front of Carnage Sword Peak was a sword chi waterfall that rumbled endlessly. Emperor Immortal vanquishing sword intent was behind the mountain. Yun Ting bade farewell to Su Zimo here and returned to Extreme Sword Peak. Su Zimo followed Lu Yun around Carnage Sword Peak. When they arrived at the back of the mountain, the roar of the sword chi waterfall disappeared instantly. Carnage Sword Peak was like an immortal sword erected here. The front and back of the mountain peak were like 2 sides of the immortal sword, isolating 2 different worlds. There were clearly fewer sword cultivators behind the mountain of Carnage Sword Peak. Generally speaking, one could only observe and sense the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing after becoming a perfected immortal. It was not that the sword world had deliberately set a threshold to make things difficult for the sword cultivators. It was because their cultivation realms were insufficient and cultivators could not withstand Emperor Immortal vanquishing sword intent head-on. At that moment, some perfected immortals behind the mountain were calm and focused. They raised their heads slightly and looked at the sword marks left behind on the back of the mountain peak, sensing them silently. Emperor Immortal vanquishing's Carnage sword intent was all contained in these sword marks. Lu Yun said softly, "Young friend Su Zhu, there's something I have to tell you in advance." The sword marks on this mountain peak were left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing back then. The Carnage sword intent inside will have a huge impact on the Dao heart. Even some paragons of Carnage Sword Peak might not be able to sit here for more than 2 hours. If you feel that something is wrong and you can't withstand it, please don't force yourself. Retreat in time and distance yourself from this Carnage Sword Peak. That way you'll be able to escape the influence of the Carnage sword intent. The moment he said that, a sword cultivator not far away suddenly opened his eyes and his expression changed as he spat out a mouthful of blood. The person panted heavily with bloodshot eyes and a murderous aura. He had already lost his rationality. Lu Yun frowned slightly and waved his robe sleeve, moving the sword cultivator far away. He called out softly, "Your Dao heart is unstable. If you continue to act tough, you will only suffer." Those words seemed to be a reminder to Su Zimo as well. The sword cultivator shuddered and the blood in his eyes faded gradually, allowing him to regain consciousness. Embarrassed, the person struggled to his feet and bowed to Lu Yun before slowly retreating. "Young friend Su Zhu, you saw it too." Lu Yun turned around and said, I don't know much about you and don't know how your Tao heart is. If you don't gain anything from sensing the Carnage sword intent, there's no need to force yourself. Your body is the most important. Su Zimo smiled. Don't worry, senior. I know my limits. Lu Yun gave a few more reminders before turning to leave. He soared all the way to the peak of the mountain. When Su Zimo arrived before Carnage Sword Peak, he did not sit down. Instead, he stood on the spot and looked at the sword marks left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing. His heart skipped a beat as he held the Bodhi seed in his palm. To him, this was the best opportunity to comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword. He could not miss it. With the Bodhi seed in his hand, his perception and comprehension increased as well. In reality, Su Zimo had cultivated the 3 great sword arts for even longer than Bai Ming Shui. Furthermore, he comprehended the first version of the 3 great sword arts. Bai Ming Shui had a sword-shaped martial spirit, talent in the sword Tao and unprecedented comprehension of the sword Tao. However, she had not been in contact with the first version ancient scrolls of the 3 great sword arts for long. Furthermore, Su Zimo possessed the body of a grade 12 creation green lotus. Be it cultivating the immortal, fiend or Buddhist Taos, there were no obstacles to it. He could fuse them into his dermic Tao and turn it into his own creation. It was the same for cultivating the sword Tao. The immortal vanquishing sword that Su Zimo cultivated was already at the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. Coupled with the fact that he had cultivated the 2 great sword arts for many years and accumulated them, now that he could sense the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing back then, the final transformation was only a matter of time. Su Zimo had mastered many killing techniques. Not only were there the 3 great sword arts, there was also a secret skill with extremely strong killing intent like White Tiger Corpse Collection. He was no stranger to killing intent. Most importantly, Su Zimo had cultivated the Yin Yang Talisman Sutra before. The inspiration for the 3 great sword arts created by Emperor Immortal vanquishing originated from a passage in the Yin Yang Talisman Sutra. When the heaven's killing intent is released, the stars are shifted out of alignment. When the earth's killing intent is released, the dragon snake shall rise. When the human's killing intent is released, heaven and earth shall topple. Su Zimo had also read the complete Yin Yang Talisman Sutra. His understanding of those words was not inferior to Emperor Immortal vanquishing. Coupled with the 3 great sword arts and the Carnage sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing, it was only a matter of time before Su Zimo comprehended the peerless divine power, the Immortal vanquishing sword. On the peak of the mountain. Brother Lu, make a guess. Who do you think will comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword first, Lin Xuanzhen, Bai Ming Shui or Yun Ting? The few of us have already made our bets. The peak masters urged. Lu Yun shook his head gently. How can it be so easy to cultivate a peerless divine power? It's difficult for the 3 of them to comprehend it in a short period of time. Who can say for sure when such a distant matter will happen? It will probably take thousands or even tens of thousands of years for the outcome to be decided. The peak master of 5 elements Sword Peak nodded and said, what Brother Lu said makes sense. In my opinion, let's change our bet to something that can be decided quickly. That's easy. The peak master of Tyrant Sword Peak smiled and said, let's bet on how long Su Zhu can last against the sword intent of Carnage Sword Peak. All right. That's a good idea. The eyes of the other peak masters lit up. The peak master of Illusory Sword Peak said, if I remember correctly back then Lin Xuanzhen, Yun Ting and Bai Ming Shui lasted for 6 hours before they were forced to retreat. Su Zhu will definitely not be able to reach 6 hours. His Tao heart will be pretty strong if he can even sit for a full 2 hours. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said. I'll bet an hour. In my opinion, he can only last for 15 minutes at most. Aren't you guys looking down on him too much? I bet he can sit for a full 2 hours. The 8 peak masters placed their bets one after another and chatted casually as they waited. Time passed slowly. 15 minutes. An hour later. In the blink of an eye, 2 hours passed and Su Zimo was still comprehending without moving. We were all wrong. Looks like Brother Lu won. The peak masters exchanged glances and shook their heads with bitter smiles. Among the 8 peak masters, only Lu Yun guessed that Su Zimo could last for 4 hours. In reality, he did not have high expectations for Su Zimo initially as well. However, after his interaction with Su Zimo earlier on, his intuition told him that this young man was far from simple. In the blink of an eye, 4 hours passed. Su Zimo was still comprehending below. To think that this lad would be able to hold on for so long? The few of us were wrong this time round. The 8 peak masters still had relaxed expressions and chuckled. As time passed, the smiles on the faces of the 8 peak masters decreased. At that moment, 6 hours had passed and Su Zimo still showed no signs of leaving. The 8 peak masters exchanged glances with grim expressions. The peak master of 5-element Sword Peak said, "This lad's Dao heart is indeed very strong. He's actually comparable to Lin Xuanjin and the other two." The other peak masters were silent. Right now it was no longer a matter of standing shoulder to shoulder. If Su Zimo continued comprehending, he would have already surpassed Lin Xuanjin and the other two. 8 hours. Su Zimo's eyes were still closed and he was motionless. After the 10th hour, Carnage Sword Peak was already shrouded in darkness by the night. However, the 8 figures on the peak did not look tired at all. Suddenly, a commotion sounded from below. Su Zimo opened his eyes and moved. Chapter 2763 Chapter 2763, Peerless Comprehension. Chapter 2763, Peerless Comprehension. Sensing that, the 8 peak masters heaved a sigh of relief. He finally can't hold on any longer. Before the peak master of Sever Sword Peak could finish her sentence, her expression changed. Something's not right. The other peak masters noticed something amiss at the same time. Su Zimo did not retreat. Instead, he took a step forward from Carnage Sword Peak. Immediately after, a shuddering and terrifying killing intent burst forth from Su Zimo's body and surged into the skies. A clear sword hum sounded from his body incessantly. The terrifying killing intent from Su Zimo touched Carnage Sword Peak and even resonated with the sword marks on it. The commotion here instantly woke up the surrounding sword cultivators. The sword cultivators widened their eyes and looked at Su Zimo in horror, retreating one after another. An extremely sharp sword chi surrounded Su Zimo's body. It was sharp and murderous. Many sword cultivators could not withstand it at all. The sword chi condensed with a terrifying killing intent and gathered behind Su Zimo continuously. In a blur, a phantom sword appeared with a faint blood color. "I didn't expect this, I really didn't expect this." Lu Yun had a conflicted expression as he lamented, "So not only does this person have a strong Dao heart, he's also talented in the sword Dao with the help of the Carnage Sword intent of Carnage Sword Peak. He actually comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword to the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. I really don't know what this person has experienced to be able to forge such a powerful Dao heart." The peak master of Zen Sword Peak praised as well. The other peak masters were silent and merely stared fixedly at the phantom sword below. As time passed by, the sword became clearer and gradually materialized. The blood color gradually enveloped its body and became even more blinding. "This is..." The 8 peak masters exchanged glances and could see the shock in each other's eyes. Could it be that Su Zhu was about to comprehend an actual peerless divine power? That was way too terrifying. Throughout history, the sword world had produced paragons and monster incarnates as well. There was no lack of people who comprehended that peerless divine power of the sword Dao. However, none of them comprehended that peerless divine power the first time they arrived at Carnage Sword Peak. If they had not seen it with their own eyes, the 8 peak masters would not have believed it. Zing! The blood-colored sword behind Su Zimo had already condensed completely and emitted a cold sword hum with killing intent. The blade of the sword seemed to be stained with blood and was like a deathly blade that was extremely dazzling in the dark night. The resonance between the immortal vanquishing sword and Carnage Sword Peak became clearer and the latter even began to tremble slightly. Carnage Sword Peak was the core of Carnage Sword Continent. The vibration of the mountain instantly woke up all the sword cultivators on the continent and they broke out of seclusion one after another. What a strong killing intent. What happened? I'm not sure. Could it be that a powerful enemy is attacking? Look over there. After the initial confusion, many sword cultivators quickly discovered the blood-colored sword that pierced into the clouds in the direction of Carnage Sword Peak and could not help but gasp. This is the immortal vanquishing sword. Heavens, someone comprehended the peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword. Ordinary disciples might not know what had happened, but legacy disciples like Wang Dong were shocked and exclaimed when they saw that. Who is it? Who comprehended that peerless divine power? Could it be junior sister Biming? That's not right. Junior sister Biming is cultivating in Myriad Sword Palace at this moment. It shouldn't be her. I think someone saw Yunting heading in that direction. When many sword cultivators saw that, they hurried to Carnage Sword Peak to take a look. On the one hand, it was out of curiosity. On the other hand, sensing the Carnage sword intent of the immortal vanquishing sword at close range was also extremely beneficial to them. On the peak of the mountain. After the initial shock, the 8 peak masters gradually calmed down. Among them, Lu Yun had the most complicated feelings. The main reason why he sent this thank you gift was because he wanted Su Zhu to realize his shortcomings and retreat after realizing that he could not impart the Tao to Biming Xue. However, to think that this thank you gift would fulfill this person's wish. It allowed this person to take the huge leap and comprehend the peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword. The peak master of Extreme Sword Peak sighed. To think that the few of us would all lose. Who would have thought that an outsider would be able to comprehend the peerless divine power of our sword Dao before Lin Xuanjun, Biming Xue and Yun Ting? The peak master of Fiend Sword Peak was exasperated as well. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak looked at Lu Yun. It's the worst for brother Lu. I'm afraid your hopes of taking in Biming Xue will come to naught. Lu Yun smiled bitterly. Su Zhu comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword first, which meant that he was extremely talented in the sword Dao. Although his cultivation realm was slightly lower, he was fully qualified to impart the Dao to Biming Xue. Even though he wanted to, it was no longer appropriate for him to mention taking in Biming Xue as a disciple. Lu Yun pondered for a moment. It's a pity that this lad isn't from the sword world. If he could join the sword world, Su Zhu, Lin Xuanjun, Biming Xue and Yun Ting would be among the legacy disciples of this generation. Their futures would be limitless. When Lu Yun finished speaking, he noticed that the other 7 didn't react and remained silent. However, the eyes of the 7 peak masters flickered, as though they were planning something. Lu Yun instantly understood and scolded, "Hey! Don't think I can't tell what you guys are up to. Su Zhu first arrived in my Carnage Sword Peak. Furthermore, he's Biming Xue's master. Even if he joins the sword world, he should join my Carnage Sword Peak." The peak master of Sever Sword Peak shrugged gently. That's hard to say. You even tried everything to stop him from remaining as Biming Xue's master just now. The fact that he arrived in Carnage Sword Peak first doesn't mean that he will join your Carnage Sword Peak. The peak master of Extreme Sword Peak said, "I've always admired Su Zhu. Furthermore, he's Yun Ting's brother-in-law. It's the most suitable for both of them to be in Extreme Sword Peak. He's most suited to cultivate the Tyrant Sword Dao. This lad has great wisdom. He'll definitely shine if he joins my Zen Sword Peak. Why make him cultivate the Zen Sword out of nowhere? Lin Xuanjun of my Sever Sword Peak doesn't have a Dao companion yet. I think the 2 of them are quite compatible. Your 3 Sword Peaks already have Lin Xuanjun, Biming Xue and Yun Ting. Stop fighting with the rest of our Sword Peaks for him." The harmonious atmosphere of the 8 peak masters earlier on was changed suddenly. They argued with flushed faces on the mountain peak, unwilling to give in to each other. Right then, the blood-colored immortal vanquishing sword swayed slightly. At the foot of the mountain, Su Zimo grunted as though he was enduring immense pain. His body trembled slightly and his skin cracked, oozing blood that dyed his green robes red. The 8 peak masters were not surprised by this. The reason why peerless divine powers were powerful was not only in terms of power. The first time a peerless divine power was comprehended, the power of the peerless divine power would descend and cleanse one's body and bloodline, tempering their essence, spirit and Tao fruit. With that, the overall strength of the cultivator would undergo a transformation. At that moment, Su Zhu was enduring the baptism of the immortal vanquishing sword. Chapter 2764 Chapter 2764 Revival of the Green Lotuses. Chapter 2764 Revival of the Green Lotuses. Each time a peerless divine power was comprehended, they would experience the same process. However, peerless divine powers were different and the way they baptized cultivators was different as well. If one comprehended a peerless divine power like astral imprisonment, the damage to cultivators would be less and the process of baptizing the body, bloodline, essence, spirit and Tao fruit would be relatively gentle. As for the immortal vanquishing sword, it condensed a peerless Carnage sword intent and had the heaviest killing power. Therefore, the impact damage to cultivators was extremely terrifying as well. If he wanted to release the Peerless divine power, he had to withstand it himself and obtain the recognition of the Peerless divine power first. The more Lu Yun looked at Su Zhu who was below, the more he found the latter pleasing to the eye. Right now, there was already a hint of worry in his eyes as he murmured. He comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword at the celestial being realm. The baptism of the Peerless divine power is extremely damaging for him. I wonder if he can withstand it. There were 4 minor realms in the perfected one realm. Naturally, the later one comprehended the Peerless divine power, the lower the risk. 4 Paradise Void perfected immortals, their physiques, bloodlines, essence spirits and Tao fruits would already be cultivated to the perfected realm and maintained at the peak. Therefore, there would not be much danger if they comprehended Peerless divine powers at that time. However, the 8 Peak Masters stared at it for a while and revealed shocked expressions. The Peak Master of Tyrant Sword Peak was shocked. This lad's physique is so strong. He was not severely injured even after enduring the sword chi of the immortal vanquishing sword. He only bled a little. That's right. This superficial wound is nothing for a perfected immortal. The Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak nodded as well. At that moment, the 8 Peak Masters had already begun to plan how to invite Su Zimo to join their Sword Peak after he received the baptism of the immortal vanquishing sword. Brother Lu. Right then, the Peak Master of Extreme Sword Peak suddenly shouted. For some unknown reason, his voice even trembled. What's wrong? Lu Yun asked casually without looking up. Look. The Peak Master of Extreme Sword Peak exclaimed. The Peak Masters could tell that there was something wrong with his tone and looked over instinctively. When the 8 of them saw everything before them, their eyes widened and their hearts skipped a beat, as though they had seen a ghost. How is that possible? The 8 Peak Masters lost their composure and were dumbfounded with shock. Behind them, the withered lotus flowers were gradually reviving and growing tender green spots to recover their vitality. The lotus flowers revived extremely quickly. Right in front of the 8 Peak Masters, their withered yellow color faded and they turned emerald green and filled with vitality. Like a spring breeze, all the lotus flowers came to life. Green lotuses swayed gently on the mountain peak and plump buds grew one after another, blooming slowly in front of the 8 Peak Masters. Not only did the green lotuses on the peak of Carnage Sword Peak recover their vitality, they even bloomed after a few breaths. When the 8 Peak Masters saw that, it was as though they were witnessing a miracle. Back then, Emperor Immortal Vanquishing scattered the lotus seeds of the creation green lotus here and planted this patch of lotus flowers. Ever since Emperor Immortal Vanquishing died and the creation green lotus shattered and disappeared, the lotus flowers on the mountain peak had never bloomed again. But now all the green lotuses on the mountain peak had revived and bloomed. What did that mean? Am I seeing things? Even now, the Peak Master of Extreme Sword Peak murmured in disbelief. How could this be? The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak frowned. Could it be related to Su Zhu? The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak said, Su Zhu only comprehended the divine power of the immortal vanquishing sword. Why would it cause the green lotuses on the mountain peak to bloom? Before this, there were also seniors of the sword world who comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword behind Carnage Sword Peak. There was no reaction from these green lotuses at that time. Lu Yun frowned and fell into deep thought. It was as though he had neglected something extremely important. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Lu Yun's mind. Prior to this, a few green lotuses on the mountain peak had undergone an abnormality and suddenly revived. That was when Baiming Shui broke through. Instinctively, Lu Yun thought that it was because of Baiming Shui's breakthrough that there was a reaction from the green lotuses. However, later on, when he called Baiming Shui to the peak of the mountain, the surrounding green lotuses did not react. As such, he disregarded that guess. Thereafter, he did not pursue the matter either. Now that Lu Yun thought about it again, he realized that he had overlooked someone. Su Zhu. When Baiming Shui broke through, Su Zhu seemed to have just entered the celestial being realm as well. If the revival of the green lotuses on the mountain peak was not caused by Baiming Shui, it might have been caused by Su Zhu. Now Su Zhu was below and the green lotuses on the mountain peak had all recovered their vitality. Su Zhu was involved both times. This could not be a coincidence. If there was anything in this world that could revive the green lotuses on the mountain peak and restore their life forces in a few dozen breaths, it would probably be the legendary creation green lotus. What's the name of the cultivator who possessed the body of the creation? Green Lotus in the heavenly world previously? Lu Yun looked down at the figure below and suddenly made the connection as he asked. The Peak Master of Illusory Sword Peak said in a deep voice. His surname seems to be Su. However, that person has already died in the Emperor's tomb. Don't tell me that you think someone from the heavenly world with the surname Su as well. Lu Yun looked at Su Zimo's blood-stained green robes below and nodded slightly. There's no mistake. He should be that cultivator with the body of the creation Green Lotus. Because the baptism of his body by the immortal vanquishing sword earlier on released the bloodline aura of the creation Green Lotus. The Green Lotus seeds on the mountain peak woke up one after another when they sensed that aura. The other Peak Masters nodded as well. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, I'm afraid only the creation Green Lotus can make the withered lotus flowers on the mountain peak bloom in such a short period of time. The Peak Master of Zen Sword Peak said, in that case, there's an explanation for another matter. Previously, when Baiming Shui transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and her life was on the line, even we were helpless. However, she was saved by this lad. I'm afraid it's also because he made use of the bloodline of the creation Green Lotus. Creation Green Lotus. A bright glint flashed through the eyes of the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak. To think that the creation Green Lotus would come to our sword world once more in this generation. Perhaps this is the will of the heavens. Everyone. Suddenly the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak said, back then even Emperor Immortal Vanquishing could not nurture the creation Green Lotus to grade 12. But now, Su Zhu has the body of a grade 12 creation Green Lotus. If it can be used well, the 8 of us have a chance of breaking through to the Emperor realm. When they heard that, the other 7 Peak Masters had different expressions. Some frowned, some glared angrily, some were shocked and some were expressionless. Lu Yun glared at the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak with a cold gaze and said slowly, Brother Shui, what are you talking about? Let me remind you. Although you cultivate the Fiend Tao, don't lose your humanity. Su Zhu is a living person. What are you thinking of doing to him? The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak frowned as well. Brother Shui, your words earlier on were indeed a little irrational. When the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak, Shui Mo, saw that the 7 other Peak Masters were looking at him strangely, he hurriedly explained, one was just saying it casually. It was just a fleeting thought. I won't really do anything to him. Lu Yun said in a deep voice, we've cultivated the Sword Tao for many years and uphold righteousness in our hearts. We only do things with a clear conscience. We shouldn't even have such thoughts. Exactly. The other Peak Masters nodded in agreement. Chapter 2765, Chapter 2765, Super Large World. Chapter 2765, Super Large World. Lu Yun glanced around and frowned when he saw countless figures speeding over in the night. The commotion here is too great and all the sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak are alarmed. Let's go down and guard his surroundings. Don't let anything happen. Protecting Su Zimo was only one of the reasons. Lu Yun was also worried that something would happen to Su Zimo during the process of receiving the power of the Peerless Divine Power, exposing the bloodline of the Green Lotus true body. This matter was of great importance and even had to be reported to the Emperor experts of Myriad Swords Palace. The 8 Peak Masters leaped down from the peak of Carnage Sword Peak at the same time. In the blink of an eye, they arrived around Su Zimo and channeled continuously, forming an impenetrable sword chi barrier around him. Not only could no living being barge in, even the gazes and spirit consciousnesses of others could not enter. Su Zimo was receiving the baptism of the immortal vanquishing sword. However, he maintained his consciousness and could still sense the commotion around him. Su Zimo frowned slightly when he saw the 8 Peak Masters appear at the same time. He merely comprehended a peerless divine power, but the 8 Peak Masters were alarmed. This did not make sense. Thankfully, because his spirit perception did not warn him and the 8 Peak Masters did not seem to be hostile towards him. Su Zimo did not act rashly either. Young friend Su Zhu, if I'm not wrong, your bloodline should be the grade 12 creation Green Lotus. Right then Lu Yun's voice sounded in Su Zimo's ears. Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. Earlier on he did bleed a little. However, it was difficult for others to determine his Green Lotus true body just by noticing the blood on his body. After all, the Green Lotus bloodline did not have any special aura and did not look any different. Su Zimo did not know what went wrong. Furthermore, he could not predict what changes would happen in the Sword World if the Grade 12 creation Green Lotus was exposed. In reality, Su Zimo had an extremely good impression of the Sword World after interacting with it for more than 3 years. The sword cultivators of the Sword World were open and aboveboard. Even towards an outsider like him, they would always treat him with respect. Even when people challenged him in the beginning, they had always upheld the principle of a fair spar. However, there was only one single creation Green Lotus in the entire world. Furthermore, it had already grown to its peak state. How many people could remain unmoved by such a treasure? Just as Su Zimo was deep in thought, Lu Yun's voice sounded once more. Young friend Su Zhu, don't worry. The 8 of us definitely have no ill intentions towards you. You can cultivate without worry. Exactly. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak added, the creation Green Lotus is extremely fated with our sword world. Even on account of the past Emperor Immortal vanquishing, we won't hurt you. The tone of the 2 Peak Masters was sincere, and coupled with the fact that his spirit perception did not warn him, Su Zimo gradually relaxed. In the current situation, if the 8 Peak Masters really wanted to harm him, he would not have a chance to escape. He might as well cultivate in peace and control the Immortal vanquishing sword first to complete his transformation. When Wang Dong and the other sword cultivators arrived at the back mountain of Carnage Sword Peak, they saw the 8 Peak Masters shielding a sword chi barrier. No one could see what was going on inside. What happened? Wang Dong asked in a low voice. Which sword cultivator comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword? They arrived late, and the sword cultivators who were at the foot of Carnage Sword Peak should know what had happened. A sword cultivator said, it's junior sister Baiming's master, fellow Taoist Su Zhu. Su Zhu. Wang Dong and the other sword cultivators who came later were stunned when they heard that name. On the way over, they guessed a few names. However, no one expected that it would be Su Zhu who comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword. Is it really Su Zhu? A sword cultivator was still in disbelief. It's true. Another person replied, previously Peak Master brought Su Zhu over. Su Zhu sensed Carnage Sword Peak for 10 hours before comprehending the Peerless divine power directly. 10 hours. Wang Dong and the others were secretly speechless. The group of them could not even last 2 hours under Carnage Sword Peak. What's going on? Wang Dong looked at the 8 Peak Masters not far away and asked in a low voice, fellow Taoist Su Zhu comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword. Why are the 8 Peak Masters alarmed and personally came to protect him? Half a year ago, when Baiming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, only Peak Master Lu Yun appeared. It was indeed shocking that Su Zhu could comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword. However, he was only an outsider after all. There was no need for the 8 Peak Masters to personally appear and protect him, right? I'm not sure either. A sword cultivator said, Su Zhu underwent the baptism of the Peerless divine power and was slightly injured. Before long, the 8 Peak Masters appeared. Many sword cultivators were puzzled but did not think too much about it. They only thought that Su Zhu's sudden comprehension of the Immortal vanquishing sword was the reason why the 8 Peak Masters valued him so much. From the looks of it, fellow Taoist Su Zhu is going to become our fellow disciple from today onwards as well. Wang Dong seemed to have seen through the intentions of the 8 Peak Masters and said with a smile. Dawn broke. Su Zimo had just completed the baptism of the Peerless divine power, and his essence, chi and spirit had clearly increased by a level. He had just broken through to the celestial being realm. Due to the baptism of the Peerless divine power, his cultivation realm had increased significantly as well and was comparable to 1,000 years of cultivation. Seniors, thank you for your protection. Su Zimo cupped his fists and thanked the 8 Peak Masters. Lu Yun smiled. Since you have the bloodline of the creation Green Lotus and have come to the Sword World, don't worry. We'll do our best to protect you. Our Sword World is a super large world within the Trichiliacosm. Although our territory is inferior to the heavenly world, our strength is not inferior. Even if that sect master of the academy can divine that you're here, we won't allow him to come to our Sword World audaciously. Lu Yun's words made Su Zimo feel a sense of warmth that he had not felt for a long time. After his ascension, he was tense at all times and was hunted everywhere. Even after he entered Heaven and Earth Academy, he could not escape danger. It was only then that Su Zimo felt slightly relieved. Senior, what was this super large world that you were referring to? Su Zimo asked. Lu Yun explained, in the medium kiliacosm, the strength of the world has little to do with the territory size. As long as there are more than 10 Emperor experts, it will be considered a super-large world. For example, the Heavenly World, our Sword World, Dragon World, Light World, Great Wilderness and some other ancient worlds are all included. If a world has more than one but less than 10 Emperor experts, it will be considered a greater world. If they only have one Emperor, it will be a middle world. Of course, there are also some worlds that don't even have Emperor experts presiding over them. Their overall strength is low and they are considered as lesser worlds. Pausing for a moment, Lu Yun continued, young friend Su Zhu, follow us to Myriad Sword Palace. Myriad Sword Palace. Su Zimo hesitated for a moment. That's the core of the Sword World. Only legacy disciples of the Sword World can head there. I'm only an outsider after all. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak smiled. You have the Creation Green Lotus bloodline and comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword. No matter how we look at it, you're not an outsider. What are we going to Myriad Sword Palace for? Su Zimo asked again. Lu Yun said, the fact that you comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword is enough to prove your talent in the Sword Dao. Baiming Shui is comprehending in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele of Myriad Sword Palace. You should go over and take a look too. Chapter 2766, Chapter 2766, Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. Chapter 2766, Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. Su Zimo was surprised. He learned from Baiming Shui that the taboo mystic classic of the Sword World was engraved on the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. Even with Baiming Shui's talent back then, she was not qualified to head to Myriad Sword Palace to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic before becoming a legacy disciple. As for him, he was just an outsider to the Sword World. Up till now, he had yet to reveal any intention of joining the Sword World. Su Zimo shifted his gaze to the other Peak Masters. The other Peak Masters were not surprised either, as though they had long known of this decision. In reality, the 8 Peak Masters were not at the level where they could make the decision for him to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. The moment Lu Yun found out that Su Zimo possessed the Creation Green Lotus, he sent a message to Myriad Sword Palace to report the matter to the Emperors of the Sword World. Before long, Myriad Sword Palace replied that Lu Yun and the others were to bring Su Zimo to Myriad Sword Palace to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. The Emperors of the Sword World had a simplistic view of the whole matter. Naturally, it would be best if Su Zimo could join the Sword World. However, even if he refused, the Sword World would do its best to protect him. The fact that they allowed Su Zimo to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele could be considered a grand gesture of goodwill with him. How sharp were the Emperors of the Sword World? They were certain that Su Zimo would definitely be one of the top experts of the upper world in the future. Su Zimo pondered for a moment and agreed before long. Nobody could remain unmoved by a taboo mystic classic on the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. Furthermore, when the Creation Green Lotus advanced to grade 12, it gave birth to an extremely sharp duckweed sword. If he could comprehend something in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele, his combat strength would increase by another level with the duckweed sword in hand. Also, he was Baiming Shui's master. Merely imparting the martial Dao would not be enough. If he could guide Baiming Shui in the Sword Dao as well, it would be extremely beneficial for the latter's future. The 8 Peak Masters brought Su Zimo to the teleportation formation of Carnage Sword Peak and teleported to Myriad Sword Palace. The moment he arrived, Su Zimo could sense that this place was different from the 8 Sword Peaks. The sword chi here was even richer and more violent. If one was not at the perfected immortal realm, it would be difficult for them to reside within Myriad Sword Palace. The territory of Myriad Sword Palace was much smaller than the continents of the 8 Sword Peaks. This place was built with tens of thousands of gigantic palaces joined together. There were multiple floors and pavilions that spanned thousands of kilometers, and it was an extremely spectacular sight looking down from above. There were old and new palaces in the group. The oldest palace was already dilapidated and was filled with traces of the flames of war and time. It was unknown what it had experienced back then. The reason why the sword chi in Myriad Sword Palace was so dense and complicated was because every single palace emitted its unique sword chi. If one were to sense it carefully, the sword intent contained in every palace would be completely different. Noticing the surprise in Su Zimo's eyes, Lu Yun explained, the palaces preserved here are the cultivation cave abodes of every immortal king and even emperors in the history of the Sword World. Some palaces have existed for a few eras and can be traced further than even Great Emperor Zenith Heaven. As for the owners of these palaces, if they died of old age in the sword world in the end, they would leave their Dermic Dao sword intent in their cave abodes as a form of inheritance. Su Zimo nodded. There was a similar situation in the Buddhist monasteries. Some eminent monks of the Buddhist monasteries would pass down their Dermic Daos as relics after they passed away. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak looked at the gigantic palaces below with a rueful expression. After Great Emperor Zenith Heaven died, the sword world suffered a calamity and was almost destroyed. Fortunately, these palaces were spared in the end and gradually developed to their current size. Su Zimo frowned slightly when he heard that, and a puzzled look flashed through his mind. Logically speaking, in Great Emperor Zenith Heaven's era, the sword world was definitely the strongest world of the Trichiliacosm. Even if Great Emperor Zenith Heaven exhausted his lifespan and died, which faction could threaten the foundation of the sword world to the point where it was almost destroyed? Furthermore, ever since he ascended to the upper world, Su Zimo had always been puzzled. Human monarch Lin Zhan had once mentioned that the Trichiliacosm was divided into minor, medium and major Chiliacosms. To be precise, the so-called upper world referred to the medium Chiliacosm. Up till this point of his ascension, he had never heard of anyone ascending to the major Chiliacosm. Where was the major Chiliacosm and how should one ascend? In fact, Su Zimo had once suspected if there was a major Chiliacosm. That was because he had encountered the tombs of 3 great emperors in the upper world. Could it be that one could not ascend to the major Chiliacosm even at the great emperor realm? If even great emperors could not do it, who could? The words of the Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak indirectly confirm something. Back then, Great Emperor Zenith Heaven did not manage to ascend to the major Chiliacosm either. Of course, there were traces and clues of the major Chiliacosm in the upper world. According to Immortal Queen Ling Long's speculation, there was a high chance that the creation Green Lotus came from the major Chiliacosm. There was a high chance that the words on the Yin Yang Talisman Sutra came from a civilization of the major Chiliacosm. Seniors. Su Zimo was silent for a long time before suddenly asking, Great Emperor Zenith Heaven was already at the peak of the upper world with his cultivation. Even so, he couldn't head to the major Chiliacosm? When they heard that question, the 8 Peak Masters revealed a hint of confusion and fell silent. After a while, Lu Yun shook his head gently. We don't know much about the major Chiliacosm either. We've only heard rumors that a specific opportunity is required before one can head there. A specific opportunity? Su Zimo was even more puzzled. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, without the specific opportunity, it's probably impossible to head to the major Chiliacosm even if you become a great emperor. Su Zimo did not ask further. From the looks of it, even experts at the Immortal King realm could not come into contact with the major Chiliacosm. We're here. Right then the 8 Peak Masters brought Su Zimo to a tall sword stele. The shape of the sword stele was completely like an immortal sword stabbed into the ground. There were small vertical words engraved on the broad blade of the sword. There were 4 words written on the hilt, Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. In front of the Zenith Heaven Sword stele, there was another woman who was comprehending the Dermic Dao with her eyes closed. It was Baiming Shui. Baiming Shui was in a meditative state and was so focused that she did not even notice the arrival of Su Zimo and the others. Su Zimo's gaze swept across the Zenith Heaven Sword stele and his heart skipped a beat. The words on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele looked familiar. In the secret pavilion of Heaven and Earth Academy, he had once unintentionally seen an ancient and tattered piece of white paper with the words, Sword Classic, at the top. The words on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele were almost identical to the words on the Sword Classic. Could it be that what's recorded on that incomplete page is a part of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic? Su Zimo stood on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele and looked over attentively. Indeed, he found a few lines of words on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele that were identical to the words on the incomplete page. Chapter 2767 Chapter 2767 The Sword Stele Hums Again. Chapter 2767 The Sword Stele Hums Again. Back when Su Zimo obtained the Sword Classic, he could sense that the sutra on the incomplete page was profound and complicated. It was probably from an extremely high-grade cultivation technique. At that time he had once used the spirit consonance art and the two true bodies read the incomplete page of the Sword Classic at the same time. Although he had some comprehension, it was impossible for him to comprehend any Dharmic Tao with just an incomplete sutra. If the two true bodies could not comprehend it, it was even more impossible for others. Otherwise, the incomplete page would not have been casually placed in the secret pavilion of the Academy. Now that Su Zimo had the chance to comprehend the complete Zenith Heaven Sword Classic, the feeling was completely different. Back then he had many questions after reading the incomplete Sword Classic. At that moment he had a hint of comprehension. Su Zimo looked at the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele with a deep gaze. Holding the Bodhi seed in his hand, he gradually immersed himself. There was naturally no need to talk about the words, Sword Classic 1 at the back of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. Zenith Heaven referred to the vast envelopment of everything. This Sword Classic was an all-encompassing greater mastery of the Sword Tao. Therefore, every sword cultivator who came to the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele to comprehend the Sword Classic could comprehend different Sword Taos according to their different Dharmic Taos. Although Baiming Shui cultivated under Carnage Sword Peak, her Sword Tao was independent and was clearly different from the 8 Sword Taos of the Sword World. Back when Baiming Shui transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, her Sword Tao had already taken form. To her, comprehending the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic this time round was an opportunity to establish her personal Sword Tao. Up till this point of his cultivation, Su Zimo had not spent too much time and energy on the Sword Tao. His cultivation was complex and involved the immortal, Buddhist, fiend and demon Taos. The Sword Tao was merely one of the branches within. The thing he had come into contact the most with was the 3 great sword arts. When the 3 sword arts were comprehended to their limits, the Carnage Sword Tao would be born. For him, he had the greatest chance and easiest comprehension of the Carnage Sword Tao. Similarly, there were thousands of profundities in the Sword Tao. However, Carnage was undoubtedly the profundity that could represent the Sword Tao the most. Su Zimo and Baiming Shui stood and sat in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. Sword Chi circled their bodies as they looked at the same Sword Classic of the Sword Tao and comprehended different Sword Tao profundities. Baiming Shui's aura became deeper and more mysterious. She was like a black hole in the cosmos, absorbing and devouring continuously. As for Su Zimo's aura, it became stronger, sharper and filled with killing intent. Lu Yun nodded to himself when he saw that. The killing sword intent revealed by Su Zimo was extremely pure. Furthermore, he had already comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword first. There was a high chance that he would advance further in the Carnage Sword Tao after comprehending the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. As for Baiming Shui, her Sword Tao was a little strange, something that even the 8 peak masters had never seen before. Right now, Su Zimo could be compared to an unsheathed sword with an oppressive sharpness such that no one could ignore his existence. However, Baiming Shui was surrounded by nothingness. It was as though all matter had been devoured by her Sword Tao and vanished. From the looks of it, Baiming Shui might be creating a new Sword Tao. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak sent a voice transmission with her spirit consciousness. Lu Yun nodded slightly. Baiming Shui specializes in the Sword Tao and should be even more talented than her master. Pausing for a moment, Lu Yun continued, however, comprehending a new Sword Tao is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Baiming Shui's cultivation realm, vision and knowledge are far from enough. I wonder if she'll succeed this time round. None of the 8 peak masters left. Instead, they guarded this place to prevent outsiders from disturbing them. The 8 of them used their spirit consciousnesses to communicate as well. In reality, Lu Yun was right. Baiming Shui's foundation was the martial Tao and her martial spirit was the sword. In terms of talent in the Sword Tao, she was indeed superior to Su Zimo's Green Lotus true body. However, Su Zimo's foundation was way too strong. The creation Green Lotus was inclusive to begin with. Even if it cultivated the immortal, Buddhist, fiend and demon Taos at the same time, it would not be affected. More importantly, when the martial Tao prime body underwent the 10th tribulation, a humanoid heavenly tribulation in the form of a sword cultivator descended with a terrifying Sword Tao. If he was not wrong, the human figure conjured by the heavenly tribulation was Great Emperor Zenith Heaven of the past. In other words, Su Zimo had personally witnessed Great Emperor Zenith Heaven use his Sword Tao. Not only that, he had even fought Great Emperor Zenith Heaven before and experienced his Sword Tao personally. As Su Zimo compared the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic before him to that situation back then, it was equivalent to Great Emperor Zenith Heaven personally imparting the Sword Dao to him. The Zenith Heaven Sword Classic was a taboo mystic classic after all and was the most mysterious and complicated. Even if Bai Ming Shui came here for seclusion first, given her talent, it was impossible for her to comprehend anything in a short period of time. Bai Ming Shui closed her eyes and frowned slightly, as though she was deeply confused. Although Su Zimo had an image of Great Emperor Zenith Heaven executing the Sword Dao back then, there were still some questions when he compared it to the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. Right then Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. In his consciousness the green lotus essence spirit extended his palm. Sensing it, a green glow appeared and floated before him. It was the fourth treasure derived from the creation green lotus, the duckweed sword. The green lotus essence spirit held the duckweed sword in his hands. The green lotus essence spirit shuddered. Instantly, his spirit perception, understanding and comprehension of the Sword Dao seemed to have increased by several times. The profundity of the duckweed sword began to take effect. Su Zimo held the Bodhi seed in his hand. In his consciousness, the green lotus essence spirit held the duckweed sword and recalled the scene of Great Emperor Zenith Heaven executing the Zenith Heaven Sword Dao. When he compared it to the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic before him, he felt enlightened. The confusion from earlier on was resolved. Buzz. The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele shuddered and the sword hum sounded once more, reverberating through the world, causing the 8 sword peaks and Myriad sword palace to tremble. What happened? I'm not sure, it seems to be from the direction of Myriad sword palace. Could junior sister Bai Ming have comprehended something again? Countless sword cultivators broke out of seclusion and looked in the direction of the hum. In the direction of Myriad sword palace, incomparably powerful spirit consciousnesses enveloped down instantly. The few old fellows of the sword world were alarmed. How long had it only been? The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele hummed once more. In Su Zimo's eyes, the words on the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele seemed to have separated from the sword stele. Every single stroke of the words were sword marks that represented a sword intent. It was as though a figure executed a peerless Sword Dao on the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and moved gracefully like an amazing dragon, leaving behind those marks. Su Zimo was immersed in his comprehension and his mind was wandering. However, he did not know that the 8 peak masters around him were staring at him in disbelief with widened eyes. Even Bai Ming Shui, who was at the side, had already awakened from her comprehension. Her comprehension had already reached a bottleneck and could not continue. Right then she heard a clear sword hum in her ears. Instinctively she opened her eyes and saw a shocking scene. Su Zimo's eyes were closed and he wielded the duckweed sword. It was as though he had fallen into a strange state as he danced in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele with a graceful posture and profound sword technique. Every single strike left a sword mark in midair that gradually entered the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and fused perfectly with the words on it. Bai Ming Shui was shocked when she saw Su Zimo's Sword Dao. As though she had comprehended something, the bottleneck she had just encountered loosened as well. Chapter 2768 Chapter 2768, Sword Burial. Chapter 2768, Sword Burial. The Sword Dao that Su Zimo released was perfectly compatible with the Dermic Dao of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic, as though Great Emperor Zenith Heaven had been reborn. Bai Ming Shui was not the only one. Even the 8 peak masters were enlightened and moved when they witnessed that scene personally. In reality, the Cultivation and Sword Dao realms of the 8 peak masters far surpassed Su Zimo. However, at that moment, Su Zimo was clearly in a strange state, as though Great Emperor Zenith Heaven had possessed him and perfectly reproduced the Dermic Dao of the Zenith Heaven Sword Dao. The scene before them was as though Great Emperor Zenith Heaven was imparting the Dao personally. Swish swish swish. Suddenly a figure appeared in midair. He had a pale face and wore an iron crown on his head. His eyes were turbid and he looked gloomy. He seemed to be extremely old, as though he would die at any moment. However, the old man's body was straight and he stood in midair like a sharp sword that stood between the world with an oppressive sharpness. Greetings. When the 8 peak masters saw the iron crown old man appear, they shuddered and hunched down hurriedly, prepared to bow. The iron crown old man waved his hand gently, indicating that they did not have to say anything. His gaze was fixed on Su Zimo, who was dancing with his sword the entire time, and a sword glint flashed through his turbid eyes from time to time. The 8 peak masters exchanged glances and were secretly speechless. To think that such a huge commotion would happen today, that even this Emperor of the Sword World was alarmed and appeared here. Although the Iron Crown old man was extremely old, his cultivation had long reached the peak of the Emperor realm. He was also one of the most senior and highest-ranking decision-makers in the Sword World. There were clearly auras of Emperor experts in the other directions as well. Although the Emperors of the Sword World did not appear, they were paying attention to everything that happened from afar. With the duckweed sword in hand, every time Suzimo executed a sword Dao, a sword beam would enter the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and overlap with the strokes of the words on it. Because of that, the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele would also emit a buzzing sword hum that lingered incessantly. The 8 Peak Masters, including the Iron Crown Old Man and the other Emperor experts who did not appear in Myriad Sword Palace, had different insights when they saw that. The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele hummed continuously for 2 hours. Half a year ago, when Baiming Shui's Tribulation Transcendence caused the Sword Stele to hum, it only lasted for less than an hour. Suzimo's sword dance became slower and slower. The Sword Dao of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic became more and more profound towards the end. Even though he had personally witnessed Great Emperor Zenith Heaven's Sword Dao, it was difficult for him to execute it with his current cultivation realm. Finally, Suzimo stopped and sat cross-D. He placed the duckweed sword horizontally across his knees and did not wake up from his epiphany. On the other side, through her earlier comprehension, Baiming Shui's Sword Dao had already taken form. Although she was only at the Convergence realm, her Sword Dao cultivation had improved and her combat strength had increased. Baiming Shui retreated slowly from the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele without alarming Suzimo. Lu Yun frowned slightly. Suzimo was not in a good state. The Zenith Heaven Sword Classic contained thousands of Sword Daos and no one could control all of them. Even Great Emperor Zenith Heaven back then only achieved this after cultivating to the Great Emperor realm. However, Suzimo was only a celestial being perfected immortal. Initially, the sword chi on Suzimo's body was extremely pure. The sword chi that was derived from the 3 great sword arts could only comprehend the Carnage Sword Dao. Now, because he had just used the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic, the sword chi on Suzimo's body had become extremely mixed. There was the Carnage Sword Dao, the Zen Sword Dao and the 5 Elements Sword Dao. Hundreds of thousands of Sword Dao auras burst forth from Suzimo's body and clashed continuously, not giving in to each other. His aura became extremely unstable as well, rising and falling. His body trembled slightly as though he was in immense pain. Lu Yun and the others looked at the old man instinctively. The situation Suzimo was facing now was extremely dangerous. If he did not handle it well, hundreds and thousands of Sword Daos would burst forth from his body. The terrifying power was enough to tear Suzimo into pieces. The Iron Crown old man had a grim expression and pondered for a moment. He merely shook his head gently, indicating for the 8 Peak Masters to not act rashly and continue watching. In reality, if it was anyone else, the Iron Crown old man would have stepped in long ago and interrupted the person. However, Suzimo had the body of a grade 12 creation Green Lotus after all and might produce other creations. It was not easy for him to judge and he could only wait and see. Right then Suzimo's aura changed. Gradually, his body emitted a dark and cold power. He exuded a declining aura that reeked of death. The Fiend Dao. The 8 Peak Masters' hearts skipped a beat. The aura that Suzimo was emitting now was clearly not of the immortal and Buddhist dermic formulations. The eyes of the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak lit up and he was secretly delighted. If Suzimo chose the Fiend Sword Dao, there was a chance that he would join Fiend Sword Peak. However, before long the 8 Peak Masters realized that something was amiss. Under normal circumstances, the Fiend Sword Dao was comparable to other Sword Daos. At that moment, the other Sword Daos in Suzimo's body seemed to be devoured or even buried by the pitch-black Fiend Chi. The 8 Peak Masters seemed to have an illusion. Suzimo, who was sitting cross-D before them, seemed to have transformed into a tomb with thousands of Sword Daos buried within. A shuddering burial intent exuded from Suzimo's body and expanded continuously, enveloping the entire Myriad Sword Palace. Not only did he want to bury the thousands of Sword Daos, he wanted to bury the entire Myriad Sword Palace. The expression of the Iron Crown old man changed. He merely dazed off for a moment and Myriad Sword Palace seemed to have turned into a gigantic tomb. The Myriad Sword Daos transformed into many swords that stabbed into the tomb, turning it into a gigantic sword tomb that was lifeless. The sword tomb could not only bury everything, it could also tear everything apart. Pust. The Iron Crown old man shuddered and snapped out of his stupor instantly, shocked. What a terrifying sword intent. Even the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele began to sink into the darkness under the sword intent. This lad wants to bury all the sword Daos. The Iron Crown old man was secretly speechless. Such boldness. In reality, Su Zimo had no choice. He had just released the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic and thousands of sword Daos were derived within his body. They were in conflict and it was difficult to resolve the situation. However, it would be a pity if he cultivated only one sword Dao and abandoned everything else. Right then he thought of a taboo mystic classic, Heaven Burial Sutra. The Heaven Burial Sutra was known as the Tomb of the Heavens and all types of living beings were buried. He tried to use the profundity of the Heaven Burial Sutra to bury the thousands of sword Daos, gradually forming the current situation where a brand new sword Dao was derived, the Sword Burial Dao. In a sense, the Sword Burial Dao was equivalent to the synthesis of the two taboo mystic classics, the Heaven Burial Sutra and Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. That was why such a terrifying scene was formed at the birth of the Sword Burial Dao. It even caused the 8 Peak Masters and the Iron Crown old man to hallucinate for a moment. Chapter 2769 Chapter 2769, Ninth Sword Peak. Chapter 2769, Ninth Sword Peak. This sword intent spread continuously. Not only did it envelop the countless ancient and gigantic palaces in the surroundings, it continued to spread. The aura of death was like a smear of ink that enveloped the 8 sword peaks. Before long, even the 8 sword peaks disappeared into the lifeless darkness. The entire sword world seemed to be buried in a gigantic tomb. Instantly, all the sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks stopped what they were doing and froze on the spot. At the same time, they felt their hearts palpitate, as though they were buried alive under a tomb by an invisible force and could not breathe. There was an extremely terrifying power hidden in the tomb. An extreme sharpness that seemed to be able to tear through everything and destroy everything. That sharpness was right beside everyone and could tear them into pieces at any moment. What a powerful sword intent. The 8 Peak Masters were shocked. The scene before them was far more shocking than Su Zimo's sword dance earlier on. However, before long, Su Zimo seemed to be unable to withstand such a powerful sword intent. His body swayed slightly and his face turned incomparably pale. He woke up from his epiphany and opened his eyes, panting heavily. Not far away, the Iron Crown old man looked at Su Zimo deeply. To be able to withstand such a terrifying sword intent and envelop the entire sword world, there was no way this lad's essence spirit cultivation was at the celestial being realm. Furthermore, this could only be done by a sufficiently condensed and powerful essence spirit. This lad is hiding his strength. Seems like he's much stronger than he appears. The Iron Crown old man thought to himself. When Su Zimo opened his eyes, he saw the 8 Peak Masters who were dumbfounded and had completely lost their composure not far away. There was also an old man with an iron crown who stood in midair with a pale face. So strong. Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. Although the Iron Crown old man did not release any sword intent, he felt an indescribable pressure in front of the old man. This feeling was something that he had only experienced before from an expert like Bo Sun. An Emperor Realm expert. Su Zimo had not expected that his enlightenment in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele would alarm an Emperor expert. Thank you for granting me this opportunity, seniors. Su Zimo thanked the 8 Peak Masters and cupped his fists towards the Iron Crown old man not far away. The Iron Crown old man descended slowly and stood on the ground like Su Zimo. The condescending pressure from earlier on had faded significantly as well. He waved his hand gently and formed a sword chi barrier around him, enveloping Su Zimo, the 8 Peak Masters and Baiming Shui. Not only could the sword chi barrier isolate sound, even the spirit consciousnesses of the other emperors of the sword world could not permeate it. Su Zhu isn't your real name, right? The Iron Crown old man asked. Su Zimo looked at Lu Yun and the others before nodding slightly. Su Zimo immediately understood that the Iron Crown old man must already know his identity as the creation Green Lotus. Since that was the case, there was no need for him to hide it. Su Zimo nodded and said, I'm Su Zimo. I was chased by my enemies because of my Green Lotus bloodline and had no choice but to hide my real name. Seniors, please forgive me. It's only right. The Iron Crown old man said, it's better for you to be careful before you can protect yourself. Pausing for a moment, the Iron Crown old man suddenly said, young friend, since you fled here, You can be considered fated with our sword world. Furthermore, your disciple and old friend is also here. I wonder if you'd be willing to join the sword world? The 8 Peak Masters exchanged glances and were secretly speechless. Given the Iron Crown Old Man's status, he actually invited Su Zimo to join the sword world personally and addressed a perfected immortal as his young friend so politely. Su Zimo was stunned as well. Naturally, he had thought of this before. However, he did not expect that an Emperor expert would appear to invite him. Baiming Shui's initially calm eyes fluctuated slightly with a hint of anticipation. Su Zimo remained silent. After the incident at Heaven and Earth Academy, he subconsciously felt wary and resistant towards joining any sect or faction. Although the sect master of the academy looked studious and spoke of benevolence, he was extremely scheming and ruthless. Even now, he still felt a lingering fear when he thought about it. When his scheme was exposed, the sect master of the academy still carried a smile and recounted his kindness towards Su Zimo, explaining that it was for the latter's own good. However, in reality, there was only one goal behind every single sentence of the sect master of the academy: to take advantage of him. Not only did the sect master of the academy want to take advantage of Su Zimo, he wanted the latter to be grateful for it. Do you have any concerns? As though he had seen through something, the Iron Crown Old Man said, "Don't worry, no one is to tell anyone about your true identity as well as the matter of the creation Green Lotus." The Iron Crown Old Man looked at the 8 Peak Masters. "The 8 of you are not allowed to tell anyone else about this, including the other emperors of the sword world." The 8 Peak Masters' hearts skipped a beat as they nodded one after another. The fact that the Iron Crown Old Man wanted it hidden even from the other emperors of the sword world showed his sincerity. Su Zimo was silent for a moment. "Even if I joined the sword world now, I might leave one day. I wonder." "It's fine." The Iron Crown Old Man smiled. "Joining the sword world will not restrict your freedom. No matter where you go in the future or what faction you create, it's up to you." "All right." Su Zimo no longer hesitated and agreed. For the past few years, the environment of the sword world, the atmosphere of cultivation and the many sword cultivators he came into contact with made him have a good impression of them. The feeling that the Iron Crown Old Man in front of him gave him was completely different from the sect master of the academy. The sect master of the academy was like an unfathomable dark abyss that no one could see through. As for the Iron Crown Old Man in front of him, his figure was like a sword and his clothes were open. His gaze was frank, making Su Zimo feel even more at ease. When she heard Su Zimo agree, Baiming Shui smiled as well. The two of them were only master and disciple. However, Baiming Shui had a different feeling towards Su Zimo, as though she was relying on him like a father. She had never had any other thoughts. She merely wanted to stay by Su Zimo's side and cultivate. She would be satisfied with that. The 8 Peak Masters were energized as well, becoming excited. Su Zimo had already decided to join the sword world. Whoever could invite Su Zimo to join their sword peak would definitely be much stronger. The 8 Peak Masters looked at Su Zimo expectantly and tried their best to signal with their eyes. If not for the fact that the Iron Crown Old Man was present, they would probably have reached out to grab him directly. The Iron Crown Old Man hollered angrily, "Why are the few of you winking? Do you want Su Zhu to become your disciple?" "What else?" The 8 Peak Masters were stunned. Lu Yun coughed gently. "Young friend Su Zhu is not an immortal king after all. He can't join Myriad Sword Palace directly or that'll be breaking the rules." "Of course." The Iron Crown Old Man nodded slightly. Lu Yun continued, "If he won't be joining our 8 sword peaks nor Myriad Sword Palace, where else could he go? Unless..." He seemed to have thought of something and stopped abruptly. The expressions of the other 7 Peak Masters changed as well. The Iron Crown Old Man said slowly, "The sword world will establish a 9th sword peak for Su Zhu that's comparable to the 8 sword peaks. Su Zhu will be the peak master of the 9th sword peak." Chapter 2770 Chapter 2770, Good Karma. Chapter 2770, Good Karma. Although the 8 Peak Masters had already guessed that, the 8 of them were still shocked when they heard it from the Iron Crown Old Man. A 9th sword peak. The 8 Peak Masters exchanged glances and smiled bitterly. Earlier on, they were still thinking about how to get Su Zimo to be their disciple. Now, there was no need for them to fight anymore. Su Zimo was the peak master of the ninth sword peak. This could also show how highly the Iron Crown old man regarded Su Zimo. Not only did he personally invite him, he even wanted to establish a single sword peak for him. With a smile on his face, Lu Yun couldn't help but tease, "Good lord, what a meteoric rise. He's now on par with the few of us." "That's right." The peak master of Sever Sword Peak smiled as well. "We have to be careful in the future and not address him as young friend anymore." The two peak masters spoke in a relaxed tone and joked, clearly harboring no ill intentions towards Su Zimo. Even though Su Zimo was about to become the peak master of the ninth sword peak with his perfected immortal cultivation realm and was comparable to them, there was no displeasure or resistance on the faces of the 8 peak masters. Instead, they were happy for Su Zimo. Baiming Shui, who had a calm expression the entire time, opened her mouth instinctively in disbelief when she heard the Iron Crown old man's decision. In the blink of an eye, her master had become the peak master of a sword peak. Among the legacy disciples of this generation, the 3 successors that the sword world valued the most were her, Yun Ting and Lin Xuanzhen. However, no matter how much the 3 of them were valued, it was not to this extent. Such treatment for Su Zimo was probably unprecedented in the history of the sword world. Su Zimo was surprised as well. Initially, he thought that he would be a normal legacy disciple after joining the sword world. To think that the Iron Crown old man would make such a heavy promise. Su Zimo cupped his fist. "Senior, I'm extremely grateful for your good intentions. However, my cultivation is insufficient and I'm still inexperienced. To make me a peak master directly, wouldn't that be?" He was not pretending to be polite, but that was the truth. It had only been slightly more than 3 years since he arrived at the sword world. The moment he agreed to join the sword world, he became the peak master of a sword peak. There was no way he could convince the masses. The peak masters of the 8 sword peaks were all peak immortal kings. Even as a perfected immortal, he was only at the celestial being realm. Among the perfected immortals of the sword world, many sword cultivators were above him. For example, Lin Xuanzhen, who was known as the #1 legacy disciple, was more qualified than him no matter how he looked at it. Unexpectedly, before Su Zimo could finish, the Iron Crown old man waved his hand. "In our sword world, background and qualifications don't matter. Your cultivation realm is a little low, but just that sword intent earlier on is enough for you to become the peak master of the 9th sword peak." The 8 peak masters nodded as well. They had just experienced that terrifying sword intent personally and still felt a lingering fear when they recalled it. Su Zimo was still hesitant. Apart from the sword burial Tao that he had just comprehended, there was probably another reason why he could become the peak master of the 9th sword peak. His green lotus true body. However, no one else knew about this and the Iron Crown old man would not permit them to spread it either. When the other sword cultivators heard that he had become the peak master of the 9th sword peak, they would definitely be indignant. At that time there would definitely be some trouble. The Iron Crown old man continued, "Don't worry, this matter is settled. No one can challenge your status. Furthermore, we can't keep a low profile about this matter. We have to hold a grand event and let the name of the 9th sword peak spread so that the surrounding worlds will know who the peak master of the 9th sword peak is." Su Zimo was dumbfounded. Lu Yun explained with a smile, "This is the good intentions of my master. Our sword world is a super large world. Your status as a peak master shall be your protection talisman. If anyone dares to lay a hand on you using their statuses or powers unfairly, the factions and worlds backing them would have to think carefully about the consequences." Lu Yun's last sentence was filled with killing intent. In reality, that was also the case. Peak masters were not ordinary legacy disciples. If an immortal king expert crossed a major cultivation realm to attack Su Zimo, it would be equivalent to breaking a hidden rule. The sword world would have every reason to retaliate and take revenge. Even immortal king experts of other super large worlds would have to think twice before attacking Su Zimo, let alone lesser worlds and middle worlds. Of course, fights between those of the same cultivation realm were other matters. In the opinion of the Iron Crown old man, although Su Zimo's cultivation realm was only at the celestial being realm, he should be able to protect himself against Paradise Void perfected immortals with his green lotus true body. Now that he was given the status of the peak master of the 9th sword peak, Su Zimo could do whatever he wanted in many worlds. Anyone who dared to touch him had to think about the sword world behind him. Congratulations, congratulations. Congratulations, Brother Su. The other peak masters went forward to congratulate him. At this point, Su Zimo could not decline any longer and could only agree shamelessly. He smiled bitterly. I'm new here and don't know anything about being a peak master. Please guide me in the future, seniors. Man? The peak master of Tyrant Sword Peak said, Brother Su, since you're a peak master, you can just address us as fellow brothers. As for the matter of the peak master, there's no rush. Once the 9th Sword Peak is established, everything will naturally fall into place. Luya nodded as well. It's not so easy to open up a new Sword Peak and there are many implications. It will probably take hundreds or even thousands of years. Brother Su, don't worry, you can slowly familiarize yourself with it. That long? Su Zimo was shocked. In a flash, the Iron Crown old man returned to his cultivation ground in the blink of an eye. Compared to the other palaces, the cultivation place of the Iron Crown old man was extremely simple and crude. There was only a simple straw hut. The Iron Crown old man pushed the door open and entered. Mist rose in the straw hut and the fragrance of tea wafted into one's nose. The vague figures of 2 other old men with white hair, one fat and one thin, could be seen drinking tea leisurely. When they saw the Iron Crown old man return, the fat and thin old man gave him a thumbs up at the same time and praised him. Ironhead, you're really something. In order to retain that kid's sword burial inheritance, you're actually willing to open up a 9th Sword Peak for him. Amateurs. The Iron Crown old man pursed his lips in disdain at the 2 old men's praise. What? Did you have any other considerations? The fat old man asked. The Iron Crown old man did not answer. He came to the middle of the 2 old men and sat down. He received a cup of fragrant tea that had just been brewed and drank it in one gulp. He closed his eyes and savored it carefully before heaving a long sigh. The Iron Crown old man opened his eyes and said slowly, The most important thing for me to let him stay in the sword world is to establish good karma with him. Even if he leaves in the future, he won't become enemies with the sword world. If the sword world is in trouble in the future, perhaps this good karma will be a chance of survival for the sword world. When they heard the last sentence, the 2 old men seemed to have thought of something and sighed deeply with rueful expressions. Chapter 2771 Chapter 2771, Change. Chapter 2771, Change. The news that the sword world was about to establish the 9th Sword Peak spread rapidly among the 8 Sword Peaks, causing a huge commotion, and the cultivators were in an uproar. Even the Immortal King experts cultivating in Myriad Sword Palace were shocked. What shocked many sword cultivators even more was that the peak master of the 9th Sword Peak had already been decided. It was not the many immortal kings of Myriad Sword Palace, but Su Zhu, a celestial being perfected immortal who had only been in the sword world for slightly more than 3 years. This outcome exceeded the expectations of all the sword cultivators. Be it in terms of cultivation realm, seniority, connections or foundation, there were too many cultivators in the sword world who were above Su Zimo. Not to mention, the status of a peak master was extremely important. Even many Immortal King experts cultivating in Myriad Sword Palace did not receive such treatment. For the past few days, Immortal Kings of Myriad Sword Palace would visit the cave abodes of the 8 peak masters every day and ask about this matter. The 8 of them could not say it explicitly and could only say that this was the Iron Crown old man's decision. Hearing that, the Immortal Kings no longer questioned. There were 3 decision-makers in the sword world and the Iron Crown old man was one of them. Although the 3 of them were old, they were once the strongest emperors of the sword world and made supreme reputations in the Trichiliacosm back then. The 3 of them were the key reason why the sword world was a super large world in this generation. The experts cultivating in Myriad Sword Palace now, be it immortal kings or emperors, had more or less been guided by the 3 of them. The Immortal King experts respected the Iron Crown old man and the other 2 from the bottom of their hearts. On the side of the 8 peak masters, apart from dealing with the Immortal Kings of Myriad Sword Palace, they had to deal with the tens of millions of sword cultivators who were in an uproar. There were more than 1,000 legacy disciples under each sword peak. Among the 8 sword peaks, there were at least 2,000 legacy disciples whose cultivation realms were above Su Zimo's. What's up with this Su Zhu? Wasn't he just junior sister Baimink's master previously? How did he suddenly become the 9th peak master in the blink of an eye? I heard that this person has already comprehended the Peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword. Even if he comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword, there's no need to make such a huge deal, right? Why open a ninth sword peak for him and even make him the peak master? Indeed, no matter you look at it, Su Zhu doesn't seem to be that capable. Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu, Sword Immortal Tai Lai, Yi Wuchen and the other top perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks gathered together and discussed this matter. Li Shui of Fiend Sword Peak frowned and asked, Brother Wang, do you know what happened? Why did they suddenly want to establish the 9th sword peak and let an outsider become the peak master? Wang Dong said, I only know that fellow Taoist Su Zhu has indeed comprehended the peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword. Later on, he was brought away by the peak masters to Myriad Sword Palace. Thereafter, news of the 9th sword peak spread. Pausing for a moment, Wang Dong smiled bitterly. Brother Li, fellow Taoist Su Zhu can't be considered an outsider now. Instead, he's the peak master of the 9th sword peak. If we see him again in the future, we'll have to treat him with respect. Li Shui did not reply and merely harumphed softly. Gong Suanyu said in a deep voice, not long after Su Zhu arrived at Myriad Sword Palace, the sword steel resonated. Thereafter, a terrifying sword intent descended. Perhaps that's related to the 9th sword peak? Qin Zhong of Tyrant Sword Peak was a little displeased and shouted, so what if the sword steel resonated? When Sister Baiming underwent tribulation transcendence, the sword steel resonated as well. However, nobody mentioned anything about opening a 9th sword peak for her. Sword Immortal Tai Lai shook his head as well. Most importantly, it's indeed difficult to convince the masses to let a celestial being perfected immortal become a peak master. Isn't that a little ridiculous? Xinyu nodded and said as well, let's not talk about others. Just any one of us is above Su Zhu in terms of cultivation, qualifications, connections and combat strength. Although he comprehended the peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword, he's only at the celestial being realm after all. His essence spirit is limited and he can't unleash the full power of the immortal vanquishing sword. Amit Ba. Monk Ju Jian of Zen Sword Peak nodded slightly as well. Even if we had to choose someone from the perfected immortals, Lin Xuanjun is probably the most qualified one. Yi Wuchen, who was also from Extreme Sword Peak, was expressionless and merely said indifferently, it's a pity that this person's cultivation realm is not high enough and he's not qualified to fight me fairly. Otherwise I'd like to spar with him. With the past 3 years, the few of them were relatively familiar with Su Zimo. However, prior to this, they only treated him as a guest from afar and treated him with respect as peers of the same generation. However, now that Su Zimo had become the peak master of the 9th sword peak in a single leap and his status was above the few of them, they could not help but feel upset. Of course, Wang Dong and the others were only complaining. They would not really cause trouble. After all, this was a decision made by an emperor expert of the sword world. Even if they were dissatisfied, they could not change it. Even the 8 peak masters did not say anything, so they could only accept it. Li Shui flicked his nails which clanked. Although he's the peak master of the 9th sword peak, he needs capabilities to be able to establish himself in the sword world. There's still a long way to go. I want to see how famous the 9th sword peak that was established for him will be in the future. There were often spars and fights between the 8 sword peaks. Now, there was another 9th sword peak. Although it was comparable to the 8 sword peaks in name, if it were to consistently rank last in the spars between the sword peaks, it would definitely attract even greater criticism. After this matter spread in the sword world, Su Zimo could clearly sense a subtle change in the attitudes of the sword cultivators towards him. When Wang Dong and the others saw him, they would still pay respects as juniors according to the rules. However, the way they looked at him seemed much more distant and colder. Su Zimo was not surprised by this change. On the one hand, due to the sudden change in his identity, making him comparable to the 8 peak masters, he was suddenly above Wang Dong and the others in terms of status and seniority. It was difficult for Wang Dong and the others to accept that right away. There would definitely be some estrangement between them. On the other hand, it was also because Wang Dong and the others were definitely dissatisfied with him being the peak master of the 9th sword peak. Wang Dong and the others could not be blamed for that indeed. He had just arrived in the sword world for more than 3 years and was only a celestial being perfected immortal. He had not done anything for the sword world or made any contributions before ascending to the position of the peak master of the 9th sword peak. Anyone would feel conflicted. This was human nature. Su Zimo could completely understand the attitudes of Wang Dong and the others. Not only that, as time passed, Su Zimo had an even better impression of Wang Dong's group and the other sword cultivators. Although these people were indignant and conflicted, they did not plot against him or cause trouble for him, let alone mock him. Although they were displeased, they respected the decision of the Sword World and treated Su Zimo as someone from the Sword World and one of their own. However, if Su Zimo wanted to truly obtain the recognition of the sword cultivators, his status as the peak master of the Ninth Sword Peak was far from enough. Su Zimo did not care about that and had no intention of changing things. To him, the most important thing was to make use of the time he spent cultivating in the Sword World to increase his cultivation as much as possible. One day he would kill his way back to the Divine Firmament Immortal Domain in the Academy. Chapter 2772 Chapter 2772 Congratulations. Chapter 2772 Congratulations. Creating the Ninth Sword Peak was far more troublesome than Su Zimo had imagined. It was an extremely vast and complicated project. The structure of the 8 sword peaks had been passed down for many years. If one looked down from above, they could vaguely see that the continent where the 8 sword peaks were located was a sword-shaped land. Between the sword-shaped land, the 8 sword peaks and Myriad sword palace, there were countless formation patterns that were difficult to see with the naked eye. They interweaved in the starry skies and formed a powerful sword formation. Once it was fully activated, the entire sword world would release an extremely terrifying killing power to defend against external enemies. But now there was a 9th sword peak to be established outside the 8 sword peaks. This meant that if they wanted to integrate the 9th sword peak into the sword formation, they would have to undo the original formation. Many formation patterns had to be erased and rearranged. The cultivators who set up this sword formation were at least Immortal King experts. It was as difficult as ascending to the heavens to open up a large piece of land out of thin air in the starry skies. The Emperor experts of the Sword World had to take action and transport back dead stars and lifeless lands from other regions of the upper world. Every single star brought back was not inferior to the Dragon Abyss star. However, the scale of the 9th continent of the Sword World had to be much bigger than the Dragon Abyss star. At the very least, it had to be comparable to the Divine Firmament Immortal Domain. Millions of stars were probably required to condense a land the size of the Divine Firmament Immortal Domain. Gathering such a large number of stars together, the Emperor experts joined forces and shattered them, condensing and hammering them continuously. In reality, the entire process involved the combined efforts of the Emperor experts to forge the 9th sword-shaped continent into a peerless immortal sword. Gathering 1,000,000 stars and condensing the essence of heaven and earth required more than 10 emperors to join forces. One could imagine how difficult it was. The formation of the 9th sword-shaped continent alone took more than 400 years. Thereafter, a mountain peak soared into the sky in the center of the continent. Su Zimo imprinted the inheritance and sword intent of the sword burial Tao on the sword peak and fused it with the entire continent. Only then would the 9th sword peak truly take shape. If any sword cultivator wanted to comprehend the sword burial Tao, they could come to this sword peak to do it themselves. During this period of time, Su Zimo cultivated while watching the evolution of the 9th sword peak. For him, it was a rare opportunity to be able to watch the emperors join forces to forge it. Of course, the formation of the 9th sword peak was not over yet. They had to set up sword formation patterns on the 9th sword peak before fusing it with the sword formation of the other 8 sword peaks and Myriad sword palace before it was truly over. Su Zimo had dabbled in array formations before as well. However, he could not interfere in a sword formation of this level. He knew that it would definitely take an extremely long time to set up formation patterns of this scale and level. It would take at least a few hundred years. For the rest of the time, Su Zimo established his own cave abode on the 9th sword peak and officially entered it. The 9th sword peak was officially named Sword Burial Peak as well. Baiming Shui was the first to move her cave abode to Sword Burial Peak. She was Su Zimo's eldest disciple to begin with, and it was understandable for her to become a disciple of Sword Burial Peak. However, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak, Lu Yun, could not accept it right away. He complained to Su Zimo many times, but Baiming Shui was unmoved. In the end, he could only let it go. Apart from Baiming Shui, the peak masters of the 8 sword peaks sent over some ordinary disciples of the Black, Earth and Heaven Essence realms as well to prevent the 9th sword peak from appearing too deserted since it had just been established. However, no legacy disciple was willing to come to Sword Burial Peak. On the one hand, Su Zimo was only a celestial being perfected immortal. More than half of the legacy disciples of the 8 Sword Peaks were either of the same cultivation realm as him or of a higher cultivation realm. It was impossible for those legacy disciples to become Su Zimo's disciples. The remaining Convergence perfected immortals had Immortal King experts as their masters. There was no reason for them to head over to Sword Burial Peak and become the disciple of a celestial being perfected immortal. On the other hand, sword cultivators who could cultivate to the perfected one realm had cultivated in the sword world for many years and had deep feelings for their respective sword peaks and fellow disciples. Naturally, they would not change factions easily. That way, although the 9th Sword Peak was successfully established and some ordinary disciples were forcefully stuffed over by the 8 Peak Masters to show their support, it still looked cold and desolate. There were only 2 perfected immortals in Sword Burial Peak, Su Zimo and Baiming Shui. One was a Convergence perfected immortal and the other was a celestial being perfected immortal. In the eyes of the other sword cultivators, it was way too shabby and even a little sad. The 2 from Sword Burial Peak did not think much of it. Instead, they enjoyed it. Both master and disciple cultivated wholeheartedly and felt that it was better if there were fewer people. After all, it was more peaceful. The news of the opening of the 9th Sword Peak had spread long ago. During this period of time, there would occasionally be cultivators from other worlds who came to offer their congratulations and even send some gifts. Most of these people were from the lesser and middle worlds and the surroundings. Lesser worlds such as Blue Cloud World, Immortal Medicine World, Treasure World and 7-Star Sword World had no Emperor Realm experts presiding over them. The strongest people in those worlds were immortal kings. Even so, one could tell the strength and influence of the Sword World. If these lesser worlds wanted to survive in the upper world, they would either have to rely on super-large worlds or be on good terms with the surrounding super-large worlds or greater worlds. Otherwise, if there was any conflict or unforeseen event, these lesser worlds might be destroyed. After all, a top Immortal King expert alone might be able to destroy a lesser world. In order to express their sincerity, most of these lesser worlds had Immortal Kings visiting with the congratulatory gifts personally. When they saw that the Peak Master of the 9th Sword Peak was only a young celestial being perfected immortal, they were dumbfounded and shocked. If not for the introduction of Lu Yun and the other Peak Masters and the fact that Su Zimo was sitting side by side with the other Peak Masters, these Immortal King experts would not have believed it. After confirming Su Zimo's identity, even though they were all Immortal King experts, these people were still polite to him. Although they were surprised, the Immortal Kings did not dare to show any contempt. Su Zimo was only a perfected immortal, but he was backed by the entire sword world. This was the deterrence the status of the Peak Master of the 9th Sword Peak had against others. It was a strange feeling. Although Su Zimo was only a celestial being perfected immortal, the visiting Immortal Kings had to be polite to him. It was no wonder why Lu Yun said that the status as a Peak Master was a protection talisman for him. At the very least, no one from the lesser and middle worlds would dare to attack him. From a certain perspective, Su Zimo's current status was even higher than the sect master of the Academy of the Divine Firmament Immortal Domain. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.